As many of you know, Dan, Eric, and I met with Douglas Wilson, Nate Wilson, Joe Rigney, Toby Sumter, and several other men from Moscow, Idaho last week. That meeting arose because the elders of our church sent a 9-page letter to the elders of Christ Church detailing our concerns with Pastor Wilson's involvement in and handling of the Joel Webbon Tobias situation, as well as his use of the Mablog to damage the reputation of other faithful pastors, including Joel Webbon. Our goal in this was to clarify motives and actions taken by Doug and to give him a chance to respond before we said anything publicly. Our desire was to promote peace if possible. Sadly, before and after our meeting, Doug continued to attack the character of Joel, Stephen Wolfe, Eric, and others, whom he called pastorally inept, in a Mablog for failing to properly police what he calls dankanons and for engaging in Revoice for Nazis. More on that later. Doug confirmed in the meeting that he does in fact believe those charges are true. Yesterday, Doug released another blog post stating that, quote, much like Revoice attempted to keep the door of flamer sympathy cracked open in the PCA, the leadership in Ogden continues to conduct a sympathetic bromance with the cancers of racial spite, malice, vainglory, and pagan tribal hate. We believe these charges are reckless, uncharitable, and false. The bottom line is that we simply don't agree about the greatest needs of the hour, a fact which became clear over the course of our lengthy conversation. While Doug and his friends believe that one of the greatest threats to the conservative movement right now is alleged antisemitism and Nazism, we believe it to be, on a much more significant scale, the subversion of our historically Christian and Protestant American culture with the slow rot of Gramscian Marxism. Doug and his friends believe that Jews in America, a notoriously left-leaning and left-voting bloc, who turned out for Kamala Harris in the November election in numbers ranging from 70 to even 80+%, depending on which surveys you believe, are fed up with liberalism and teetering on the brink of conversion to conservative politics. They believe that the deep state is desperately trying to prevent this from happening by fomenting anti-Semitic rage within the conservative movement. We simply disagree that this is a likely course of future events. We don't see Jews in America suddenly turning from deeply ingrained political action, like their support of transgenderism, LGBTQ, open borders, free pornography, government censorship of social media, and all the rest, to the politics of Christian conservatism, let alone Christian nationalism. This to us seems like magical thinking on a near absurd level. Even worse, it's not just that we disagree with the likelihood of this outcome. It seems rather that anyone acting on the sincerely held belief that this is a highly likely outcome in the near future is in grave danger of being subverted, of living under a leftist gaze, tailoring their actions to ingratiate themselves with one of the most liberal groups in America. Has this kind of tactic worked in the past? Let's test this thinking with a recent example. 83% of black voters punched their ticket for Kamala Harris in the 2024 presidential election. This is consistent with their voting patterns in the previous 3 elections and beyond. Over this time period, a huge amount of energy on the right was spent supporting DEI programs, hunting down white racism, and virtue signaling to the black vote. Just a few examples of this would include Alabama Governor Robert Bentley's 2017 authorization to remove a plaque commemorating Jefferson Davis from an Alabama courthouse, Republican Governor Tate Reeves' 2020 legislation retiring the Mississippi state flag for its inclusion of the Confederate battle emblem, and Mitch McConnell's support for an initiative to rename military bases previously named after Confederate heroes. Did this turn the tide for black voters? Did they suddenly begin to vote Republican, softened by our national self-flagellation? Of course not. And politicians on the right who tried to pander to the black vote in this way only ended up aiding and abetting in the creation of a culture where men like Daniel Penny and Kyle Rittenhouse would be dragged through show trials for the crime of being white men in America who tried to do their duty. Here's the problem with this tactic. To embrace witch hunts for racism and anti-Semitism is to embrace the left's frame from the outset. All it serves to accomplish is the enforcement of leftist cancel tactics on the right. So to summarize, Doug, Nate, and others in Moscow are convinced that the deep state is attempting to prevent Jews from teaming up with conservatives. Because of this, they believe it's very important to leverage public statements and media to attempt to show how much we all hate anti-Semitism, how much we all agree with their definitions of what that means in the first place, and otherwise make sure everyone knows that we think all those people noticing things are probably feds sent by the deep state to keep the Jews liberal. This belief is driving their online anti-Semitism witch hunt. We don't share that belief, and so we have behaved accordingly. Rather than accepting this leftist framing, we've instead opted to do what is often the most potent action one can take when faced with idols and their attendant blasphemy laws: make fun of them. False gods hate it when you make fun of them. Now, none of this, of course, means that our behavior amounts to anything like a sympathetic bromance with the cancers of racial spite, malice, vainglory, and pagan tribal hate. That is slanderous nonsense, which we reject with prejudice. As just one example from a recent piece of alleged evidence of our raging anti-Semitism, Doug points to a video I shared on X. It was a Christian-themed montage contrasting the hateful attacks of leftists against our Protestant and Christian heritage in America with moving scenes of Anglo-Protestant culture. One of the cuts in the video shows one such example of leftist perversion, a brief scene cut from the 2005 black comedy slasher film Santa's Sleigh. The conceit of the movie, written and directed by Jewish filmmaker David Steinman, is as follows. After a millennium of spreading Christmas joy due to losing a bet with an angel, Santa Claus, who in the movie is Satan's only son, by the way, reverts to his demonic self and gives the gift of evil and fear. Following this plot, the demon Santa then goes on a killing spree, murdering lots of people, including a Jewish guy with his own menorah. Now, to be clear, none of this violent stuff was in the video I shared. Instead, it was a brief cut from a scene where the demon Santa walks past a small group of men who are obviously Jewish. In the montage I shared, this scene is immediately followed by a clip of actor and director Mel Gibson from a totally different movie, a scene where he looks back over his right shoulder as if he's noticing the clip that went before and giving it a knowing look. And now to the point. What does this mean? Well, Mel Gibson is quite famous for pointing out the Jewish subversion of Christian culture via the Hollywood film industry, or infamous, I suppose, depending on who you ask. Anyway, put the two scenes together and the point is obvious. We see what you're doing, Jewish Hollywood, and we won't let you get away with it. Christmas belongs to Christ, not blood-soaked Jewish slasher films aimed at blaspheming him and subverting American culture to leftism. Doug's summary of this clip was, let's just say, different. Here is his conclusion about the lay of the land in light of the clip. Quote, we now find ourselves in something like that scene in Prince Caspian when Nickabrick and the Black Dwarves want to ally with ghouls and witches and Jew-killing Santas. Like Truffle Hunter and Trumpkin, we won't do it. What fellowship does light have with darkness? 2 Corinthians 6:14. There it is, guys. Because I shared this video and think it made it an important point about our culture and the battles of our time, I'm Nickabrick, the black dwarf who wants to resurrect ghouls and witches in necromantic ceremony. I am allied with Jew-killing demon Santas. While it might seem like the charity is about as dried up as it could possibly be at this point, Doug ends with a dark prophecy over our little town, church, and publishing house. Quote, within a few years, Ogden will have either fully succumbed and been torn apart by the poison they are currently declining to resist, or by God's grace, they will eventually stand and fight and triumph over this toxic nonsense. In the latter case, if and when that time comes, we will rejoice to have gained wiser and more battle-tested allies, end quote. It's hard to resist the conclusion that, to Moscow, unless we agree with them on their read of the political landscape, their theory of the Jewish vote, their definition of anti-Semitism, the propriety of sharing or not sharing campy white boy summer memes, basically all of their views all the way down the line, then we are poison-drinking knaves teetering at the edge of the abyss. We are deep state stooges feasting on toxic nonsense. The only solution is to flee to the safety of their positions on all these things. The simple problem is that we don't agree with that either. We think there's plenty of room for nuance, disagreements, and all the rest on basically all of these issues. We don't begrudge Moscow for their read, even if we think it's off. I literally don't care if Doug never wears pit vipers or chuckles at a white boy summer meme. Such a thing doesn't keep me up at night. So if I might make a simple request at the end of these introductory remarks, it would be something like this. How about we agree to disagree without the name calling and prophecies of doom? We recorded the episode that follows prior to our meeting in Moscow. We had withheld its release in hopes that the tactics and issues we describe in what follows would be effectively addressed in private. In fact, our hope was that our concerns would be allayed and subsequently that the episode need never be released at all. We believe we were fair and charitable in the episode, particularly in contrast to the name-calling and frankly wild accusations of the aforementioned Mablog. If you followed us throughout this escalating war of accusations, epithets, debates over anti-Semitism, and all the rest over the last months, you know that we've tried hard to avoid unnecessary brother wars. This hasn't been easy, as accusations and epithets have been publicly attached to our names by several prominent leaders. But in consultation with our session, it seemed necessary to exercise patience. However, in light of these continued and very much public attacks on our good names, we believe it necessary to release the episode now. In what follows, we hope you'll discover that, much to the disappointment of our assigned federal agents, we are neither Nazis nor men content to live under the leftist gaze. In this episode of the King's Hall podcast, we want to ask and answer three important questions. Why aren't we signing or supporting the Antioch Declaration? What is the vision for Christian nationalism we're promoting? And finally, what are we hoping will come from this episode? We'll delve into those questions in just a moment, but first, this is after all the King's Hall, we'll begin with a story. In 1925, William F. Buckley Jr. was born in New York to a millionaire Texas oil baron. He would receive the most lavish of upbringings, thanks to his father's massive wealth, as the family occupied multiple residences in England, France, and Connecticut. He received his early education from private tutors and an English all-boys school, then later a prep school in New York. After a year of studies at the University of Mexico, Buckley would serve 3 years in the U.S. Army during World War II as a second lieutenant. After the war, Buckley enrolled at Yale, where he was a member of the secretive and all-powerful Skull and Bones Society, an odd group shrouded in dark mystery and cultic ritual. Founded in 1832, the secret society is also known as Order 322 and the Brotherhood of Death. Stories about the society abound, from rumors that they met in a tomb near campus to initiation rites that induced loud wailing and the drinking of blood from a skull, and even a fixation with the occult. As for the meaning of 322, it is said to be the date of Demosthenes' death, 322 BC, a man known for his brilliant intellect and political savvy. The society also worships Eulogia, the goddess of eloquence. Its members, known as Bonesmen, have been connected to various conspiracy theories, largely because they have always formed an interconnected network of America's most powerful elites. Bonesmen alumni include men like Buckley, George H.W. Bush, John Kerry, and many others who have occupied roles in the State Department, White House, Judiciary, and CIA. In 1951, Buckley signed on at the Central Intelligence Agency and worked in Mexico. While at the CIA, he published God and Man at Yale, and later The Road to Yenin, which told of a communist conspiracy to obtain world domination. In 1954, Buckley wrote another book, this time defending Joseph McCarthy and his purge of communists. Then, a pivotal moment that would shape the landscape of conservative politics for decades. In 1955, Buckley founded National Review, a right-wing journal with tremendous influence on the elite ruling class. Because of his work at National Review, Buckley would become a conservative icon. Later, in 1962, Buckley's column On the Right would appear in more than 200 newspapers nationwide. He would also serve as host of the PBS television show Firing Line in the late 1960s. He supported Barry Goldwater and later launched Ronald Reagan into the political stratosphere. Buckley met Reagan before he had entered politics and helped jumpstart his political career, first as governor of California, then for the presidency. Buckley's career was not without controversy, as he weaved together powerful relationships between an elite class of politicians, statesmen, and the intelligence community. For example, on September 18, 1976, a Chilean foreign ambassador was killed in a car bomb. Several of George H.W. Bush's agents were connected to the assassination, and so as director of the CIA, Bush quickly sought to cover up the incident by spreading disinformation. Buckley also took part in the disinformation campaign. In fact, he ran disinformation campaigns for Chilean factions as early as October 1974, according to investigative journalist Donald Freed. He also discovered that Buckley's brother, James, had met with the assassin, Michael Townley, a week before the assassination. Townley later confessed to the killing. Buckley also played a somewhat controversial role as editor-in-chief at National Review because of the way he used his position to gatekeep the right, which led to his extremely public fallout with several of his longtime friends and writers. One of those men was Joe Sobran, who wrote for National Review for years, but came into Buckley's bad graces because of his stance on Israel. Critical of U.S. foreign policy in relation to Israel, Sobran was a decorated journalist, devout Roman Catholic, commentator on CBS Radio, and regular columnist for the Los Angeles Times and Chronicles magazine. He was also a media fellow at the Mises Institute. In 1993, Buckley took Sobran to lunch and told him to stop criticizing Israel's domestic and foreign policies because Buckley said, quote, "We need these people," end quote, referring to the Jews. Sobran refused to budge on the issue, resulting in his abrupt and unceremonious firing. Buckley reportedly returned to his office after their lunch and sent his old friend a fax informing him of his termination. What brought about Buckley's ultimatum was that Sobran had written a column in which he said Buckley was, quote, "jumpy about the Jews." He hadn't just touched the third rail of Jewish influence in America, Sobran had grabbed it with both hands. It would spell the end of his time at National Review. Of the incident, Sobran later said, quote, "Since then, it has become a neoconservative legend that I was fired for anti-Semitism. But the truth is that it was far more personal than that. Bill knew me too well to make such a charge. I was fired for making him look bad. He considered making others look bad his prerogative," end quote. Once loyal friends and fellow Catholics, Buckley would indeed publicly smear Sobran and Pat Buchanan, also a writer for National Review, as anti-Semites. It wasn't a new initiative for Buckley. After starting the magazine, he took it upon himself to ensure that anyone critical of the Jews or a Jewish state would not be welcome in the conservative ranks. It became part of his key mission to root out those who'd taken the wrong side on Israel. In the end, he would politically and economically destroy anyone who opposed pro-Israel foreign policy, including old friends. Although conservative, Buckley was also squarely within the 1950s liberal consensus, or what has been lately called the post-war consensus. Even as communism, with its death toll in the hundreds of millions, stood threateningly off to the left, Buckley's conservatives also began to fear the reemergence of a right-wing threat in the form of fascism, with its attendant companions, religion and nationalism. Buckley's anti-communistic bent was a major feature of the direction in which he ultimately took the conservative movement as a whole. And in this, he would play a leading role in reducing the right to a monolith based not in true conservatism, but in the left liberal consensus. As long as someone was an avowed anti-communist, or more particularly, an anti-Stalinist or anti-Sovietist, Buckley was generally willing to welcome them into the conservative ranks. From the 1930s to the 1950s, the conservative movement was dominated by the old right, with its emphasis on opposition to the New Deal policies of FDR, the Federal Reserve, and globalist intervention on the foreign policy front. But then, in the 1960s with National Review, Buckley started purging right-wing ranks of what he considered radicals, which largely meant the old right. Buckley would in turn welcome Trotskyites, New Deal social democrats, Truman Humphrey liberals, and others from the quota-loving, advanced victimological left. And this group would become what we now call the neoconservatives. As Murray Rothbard pointed out, Buckley has effectively purged the conservative movement of the real right and allowed it to be taken over by enemies. Why did Buckley, the self-appointed pope of conservatism, do it? After helping Reagan get elected in the 1980s, Buckley was ready to take his movement to the real places of power in America. To do this, he judged that conservatives had to rebrand themselves in a way that gained them respectability with liberal centrist elites. He was constantly concerned, for example, about what the editorial board at the New York Times thought of him. As Paul Gottfried wrote, quote, "Like many other American journalists in the second half of the last century, Buckley moved periodically to the left to remain relevant. He also moved in that direction during the second half of his life because of his extensive involvement in New York social life," end quote. Gottfried concluded with an anecdote from his interactions late in Buckley's life. He wrote, quote, "As a final memory, I recall my correspondence with Buckley in the late 1990s, when he asserted that he had never changed his political or moral principles. I only wish that were true," end quote. Buckley's strategic maneuvering was controlled, effectively, by the gaze of those to his left. Rothbard explains, quote, "Buckley was almost ready to take power in America, but not quite, because first, all of the various heretics of the right, some left over from the original right, all the groups that were in any way radical or could deprive the new conservative movement of its much-desired respectability in the eyes of the liberal and centrist elite, all these had to be jettisoned," end quote. The purge included, most especially, men like Joe Sobran and Pat Buchanan and the John Birch Society, all of whom represented that old right. The Birchers were out not because they were anti-Semitic, as Buckley claimed, but because they opposed U.S. intervention in the Vietnam War and the global proxy wars in general. But it's also important to understand how these opponents of Buckley were attacked and where. Buckley would dig deep into the left's playbook for his official excommunications. Again, Rothbard writes, quote, "They would trot out the old psychobabble as well as the old smears of bigotry, anti-Semitism, the specter of Franco, and all the rest," end quote. Most especially, they would accuse Buchanan of being psychologically unstable, full of negative emotions, including anger and resentment. Buckley and the neocons managed to establish the notion that anyone to the right of them was, by definition, the representative of forces of darkness, of chaos, old night, racism, and anti-Semitism. The basic method, Rothbard went on, was to divert attention from the content of the radical right message and direct attention instead to a personal smear of groups on the right, end quote. Radicals on the right, Buckley and others would claim, suffered from what they called, quote, "politics of resentment," end quote. It's worth pointing out that the same strategy is in play today. Instead of engaging the arguments of the so-called radical right, liberal gatekeeping conservatives will charge that their opponents are seething with hatred or crackling with envy. Buckley chose the media as his battleground for the purge of radicals on the right. But why? Clearly, Rothbard said, because the media, especially the respectable and influential media, begin and continue with a strong left liberal bias, end quote. Virtually every conservative in the mainstream media is what Rothbard called an establishment liberal conservative. The motivation Rothbard returns to time and again for Buckley is respectability, and through it, access to mainstream platforms and power. Of Buckley's role in policing and purging the right, John Miller wrote in National Review, quote, "In his pivotal role as doyen of the American right, Buckley ensured that anti-Semites had no place in the pages of conservatism's flagship publication, National Review. But as the Cold War came to an end, right-wing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism reappeared. As the writings and statements of men like Pat Buchanan and Joe Sobran became even more hostile to Jews in Israel, Buckley again stepped into the breach. In a special issue of the magazine, and then in a fuller and annotated book, Buckley set out in search of anti-Semitism. Though he said it pained him to accuse his longtime friends and allies, Buckley ultimately concluded that men like Sobran could not be defended from the charge of anti-Semitism that ought to have no place on the right, end quote. Miller is right to point out that Buckley had been involved with purges from the beginning, but it was not primarily because of anti-Semitism in the early days. Mainly, it was because these voices, many of them Jewish, were against U.S. military intervention on a global scale. Buckley's purge of anti-Semites would take full force in the late 1980s and 90s. In the early 1990s, just as Pat Buchanan announced his presidential run, a special issue of National Review hit newsstands. Its focus was on anti-Semitism. Buckley's keynote article set the tone. It was titled, "In Search of Anti-Semitism." In the essay, which later became a book by the same title, Buckley charged Pat Buchanan, Joe Sobran, and Gore Vidal with anti-Semitism because of their views on Israeli foreign policy and their contention that American Jews had divided national loyalties. It was quite obviously a well-timed political hit job. With the old right ascendant in the person of Buchanan, it was an opportunity for Buckley to parade out his old bag of tricks and smears. Again, Rothbard writes, quote, "It was time to trot out the old master, the prince of excommunication, the self-appointed pope of the conservative movement, William F. Buckley Jr. It was time for Bill Buckley's papal bull," end quote. The problem for Buckley was that he wasn't up to his old form. Again, Rothbard describes the essay In Search of Anti-Semitism in this way, quote, "The first thing to say about Buckley's essay is that it is virtually unreadable. Gone, all gone is the wit and the sparkle. Buckley's tendency to the rococo, an elaborately ornamental style, has elongated beyond measure. His prose is serpentine, involuted and convoluted, twisted and qualified, until virtually all sense is lost. Reading the whole thing through is doing penance for one's sins, and one can accomplish the task only if possessed by a stern sense of duty, as one grits one's teeth and plows through a pile of turgid and pointless student term papers, which indeed Buckley's essay matches in content, in learning, and in style," end quote. Buckley may have lost his touch in later years, but in his prime, he was a master wordsmith with an extensive vocabulary and sharp wit. He was also often quite clever and subtle in how he accused Sobran and Buchanan of anti-Semitism. He often left himself a path of escape should pushback to his claims arise. For example, in Search of Anti-Semitism, he wrote, quote, "If you ask, do I think Pat Buchanan is an anti-Semite? My answer is he is not one. But I think he said some anti-Semitic things," end quote. Oddly enough, as Sobran pointed out, quote, "My old boss, Bill Buckley, wrote an entire book called In Search of Anti-Semitism without bothering to define anti-Semitism," end quote. After reading what Buckley had written, Sobran said, quote, "At the time, I thought his inclusion of me was an oversight. I was wrong. The word anti-Semitism would lose its utility for Buckley if it were defined. As I observed in the book, an anti-Semite used to mean a man who hated Jews. Now it means a man who is hated by Jews," end quote. Ironically, the use of ill-defined labels like anti-Semitism to smear a man is actually straight out of the Soviet playbook. Sobran explains, quote, "The very word anti-Semite is reminiscent of the term anti-Soviet. It serves a similar function of facilitating imputations of ill-defined guilt. The strength of Western law has always been its insistence on definition. Clear definitions put a burden of proof on the accuser, and properly so. If you falsely accuse a man of murder or burglary, not only is he apt to be acquitted, you may pay a heavy penalty yourself. As a result, few of us are afraid of being charged with murders and burglaries we didn't commit," end quote. Likewise, Sobran pointed out that a term like anti-Semitism is useful for character assassination because the accuser never actually has to define or prove anything. He writes, quote, "If you want to distinguish between the innocent and the guilty, you define crimes precisely. If, however, you merely want to maximize the number of convictions, increase the power of the accuser, and create an atmosphere of dread, you define crimes as loosely as possible. We now have an incentive system that might have been designed to promote loose charges of anti-Semitism," end quote. Of course, Sobran did not hate the Jews and had exhibited exactly zero hostility toward them. He simply saw a problem with an Israel-first foreign policy strategy and happened to notice, like many others, that Jewish control over media and politics was substantial. He wasn't the first conservative to say this sort of thing and get in hot water for it either. Russell Kirk, for example, said on multiple occasions that neoconservatives mistook Tel Aviv for the capital of the United States. Outrage ensued. In any case, the accusation from Buckley against Sobran was enough to damn him in the press. Ironically, Sobran said that Buckley, his longtime mentor, once shared the same criticisms of Israel. He had simply changed with the prevailing political winds. Sobran wrote, quote, "In my 21 years at National Review, I had a front row seat. I watched closely as Bill Buckley changed from a jaunty critic of Israel to what I can only call a servile appeaser. In its early days, the magazine published robust editorials, blasting politicians who sacrificed American to Israeli interests in order to pander to the Jewish vote. In those days, it was considered risque to suggest that there was a Jewish vote. Today, Bill's magazine supports Israel with embarrassing sycophancy, never daring to intimate that Israeli and American interests may occasionally diverge. It has forgotten its own principles. Today, it would never dare to publish the editorials written by its great geopolitical thinker of those early days, James Burnham," end quote. Noticing Jewish influence in the media had become, according to Sobran, a career-ending taboo. He said, quote, "The fear of the label anti-Semitic is a fear of the power that is believed to lie behind it, Jewish power. Yet this is still pretty much unmentionable in journalism. It's rather as if sports writers covering pro basketball were prohibited from mentioning that the Los Angeles Lakers were in first place," end quote. Sobran hasn't been the only one to recognize that you aren't allowed to talk about Jewish influence. Take, for example, the more recent instance of Dave Chappelle, who said on Saturday Night Live, quote, "Early in my career, I learned that there are two words you should never say together. Those words are the and Jews. Never heard someone do good after they said that," end quote. He went on to say, quote, "If they're black, then it's a gang. If they're Italian, it's a mob. But if they're Jewish, it's a coincidence, and you should never speak about it," end quote. Not surprisingly, his monologue drew widespread blowback in the media, including the ire of the ADL. Buckley, for his part, had learned how to apply the anti-Semitic label effectively and with force against his opponents, as he often did in his later essays. For example, he once wrote, quote, "I find it impossible to defend Pat Buchanan against the charge that what he said and did during the period under examination amounted to anti-Semitism. Whatever it was that drove him to say and do it, most probably an iconoclastic temperament," end quote. What had Pat said, you may wonder? Among other things, Buchanan made televised remarks criticizing U.S. involvement in the Gulf War. He said, quote, "There are only two groups that are beating the drums for war in the Middle East, the Israeli Defense Ministry and its Amen Corner in the United States," end quote. Soon afterward, Buchanan referred to the U.S. Congress as Israeli-occupied territory. Later, Buchanan predicted that the men fighting in the Gulf War would be, quote, "kids with last names like McAllister, Murphy, Gonzalez, and Leroy Brown," end quote. Of this, Buckley said, quote, "There is no way to read that sentence without concluding that Pat Buchanan was suggesting that American Jews managed to avoid personal military exposure even while advancing military policies they uniquely engineer," end quote. Buckley's policing of the right-wing camp by way of vindictive smear campaigns that fed its members to the left liberal mob has been a long-standing strategy for many gatekeeping entities on the conservative right. It's one of the reasons the right is so rarely victorious in its opposition to the left, because elements on the right are constantly being destroyed by their own. Given Buckley's association with the Skull and Bones Society and the elites who controlled the White House, State Department, major banks, and the CIA, as well as connections to men like George H.W. Bush, one has to wonder if Buckley functioned as some sort of controlled opposition within the conservative ranks. Of this gatekeeping tendency on the right, Paul Gottfried once wrote, quote, "Conservatism, Inc. has a long history of purging undesirables who challenge its party lines. But those in charge of the movement typically hide this practice. When the movement can no longer conceal the obvious, it provides justifications for its actions, hoping that such will play well in the court of liberal public opinion. Thus, the movement has lied about its early expulsion of Jewish libertarians and then its later campaign against the John Birch Society, pretending in both cases that it was distancing itself from racists and anti-Semites. The real reason for these excommunications, as far as I can determine, was that those who were expelled did not share the aggressively anti-Soviet and anti-communist foreign policy that William F. Buckley Jr. and other editors at National Review were then promoting. After the neoconservative takeover of the movement in the 1980s, those isolated few who resisted lost their access to conservative funding and were removed from the mastheads of conservative publications. This blacklisting was in line with the movement's earlier history of expulsions, and such events became even more prevalent in the 1990s as paleoconservatives were pushing back hard against the neoconservative takeover of the authorized right." End quote. Buckley's motives for canceling Sobran, it turns out, were not purely ideological so much as pragmatic and political. In the end, Buckley was pressured by outside forces to get rid of Sobran. He sought both donors and respectability, and he saw the paleoconservatives as a threat to the attainment of those ends. As Jack Trotter wrote in Chronicles magazine in 2020, quote, "Sobran was fired in 1992 after charges were leveled at him by Midge Decter and her husband Norman Podhoretz, editor at Commentary. The crux of the matter was that Sobran's columns criticizing the Israeli lobby were deemed by Podhoretz and Decter, hypersensitive to perceived anti-Semitism as they were, to be scurrilous. In Decter's words, Sobran himself was little more than a crude and naked anti-Semite. Podhoretz and his wife Midge Decter, maiden name Rosenthal, were both Jews. Podhoretz's parents immigrated from Poland, present-day Ukraine, and settled into the Jewish New York culture as staunch leftists. He gained acceptance to Harvard, but instead attended Columbia University and then later the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. He never intended to enter the rabbinate, but his father wanted to ensure that his son was nonetheless conversant in the intellectual tradition of his people as a non-observant New World Jew who treasured the Hebraic tradition." End quote. In other words, outside pressure from Jewish influence and other donors caused Buckley to detonate his relationship and decades-long friendship with Sobran. Again, he succumbed to the left liberal gaze and burned one of his friends to the ground to satiate detractors and donors. Today, we face similar problems on the right. Right-wing gatekeepers are often willing to broker for greater platform exposure through deals with centrists and leftists in exchange for eliminating extremist elements on the right. Often, as Gottfried pointed out, right-wing gatekeepers will do this without ever being asked. Those who do the policing of the ranks gain more power by destroying other right-wing opponents in the media, which is left-controlled space. One of the easiest ways to do this is to accuse those on the right of the kind of things the left liberal consensus finds most appalling: racism, anti-Semitism, and Nazism being the epithets of choice. To cancel, denounce, or dox someone isn't fundamentally about engaging with their arguments. It's about attaching some unforgivable sin to them in the form of a slur that triggers public outrage. Like Sobran, the goal is that the doxed become unemployable, untouchable, anathema, so that they're left driving FedEx delivery trucks. A respectable profession, to be sure, but not one generally associated with the kind of political and social power needed to lead the national conversation. This type of behavior is largely what prompted Charles Haywood to weigh in with his principle, "No enemies to the right," which was later amended to "No enemies on the right." Haywood noted that for the right to gain victory, it had to stop destroying its own by feeding them to wolves on the left. Yes, corrections to the camp should be made, but they should be made within the camp. The principle is simple: settle disputes privately, save your strength for destroying the real enemy on the left, where there are genuine and acceptable disagreements in strategy and cultural political engagement. Right-wing groups should agree to pursue their ends without trying to destroy or constantly countersignal one another. Haywood's original netter proposal came in an interaction about Rod Dreher, because Dreher had often spoken softly about the left, saving his fiercest attacks for those on the right. Of this tendency, Haywood wrote, quote, "Guys like Dreher endlessly complain about the left and its evils, but never do they wield actual power against the individuals about whose behavior they complain, which could advance their claimed goals. Instead, they only wield what power they have against individuals whose beliefs they regard as to their own right. These are the same individuals as those targeted by the left, and the more so they show any tendency to become leaders or network nodes on the right. Dreher is a prime example of this tendency on the supposed right. He always talks lovingly about his friends on the left, notably the odious David Brooks, and defends them to the last gasp. He does not seem to realize, or will not admit to himself, that his friends would gladly throw him to the wolves if he ever did anything such as, say, use a slur to refer to homosexuals or state the obvious, especially in light of his obsession with the scandals surrounding Catholic clergy, that many homosexuals are created by homosexual abuse of children, and that homosexuals abuse children at a vastly greater rate than normal people. Yet never, ever does he say anyone to his right is a friend. He runs from them in horror and hurts them when he can. In fact, the absolute limits of all acceptable rightward behavior for Dreher is set by reference to Dreher himself. Anything to his right is ipso facto unconscionable, disgusting, evil, or all three." End quote. By becoming a compliant gatekeeper for the left and drawing lines around conservative orthodoxy, Dreher had secured for himself an untouchable seat at the table, but at what cost? Again, Haywood writes, quote, "We can see the results of his compliance with the left dictates in the arc of Dreher's career. Dreher is never substantively attacked by the left because he is regarded as not a threat despite his notable prominence on the right. His defenders respond that his contribution is converting the normies. This is false. If he were converting the normies, he would be regarded as a threat and targeted. Rather, he is lecturing the already converted who are unhappy about left victories surging ever higher, advising them to be angry about the left, but never to take any determined action against the left. And always to police your mind and speech, to purify it of anything that the left might find too objectionable. If Dreher were honest and he looked at himself, he would realize that his actions show that for him, beginning with the end in mind means seeking the eternal domination of the left." End quote. As men like Dreher prove, the greatest obstacle to building a formidable movement on the right is actually vicious gatekeepers on the right, not the left. As these gatekeepers inevitably drift left, they publicly anathematize anyone to their immediate right, which drags the conservative movement further left and makes it impotent. The removal of actual conservatives on the right only solidifies a sure victory for the left. Unfortunately, many conservative Christians have also employed this strategy: pander left, punch right. In 2021, Doug Wilson helpfully described this type of dynamic in his blog post, Kevin DeYoung and the Taxonomy of Conflict. In that article, Wilson describes a scale from 1 to 4, in which 4s speak most courageously on cultural hot-button issues, and 1s simply agree with the left's framing. The 3s are DeYoung Big Eva types, who will be friendly in public discourse with 2s, but, and here's the key point, always distance themselves from 4s. To the 3s, the 4s represent the dangerous right that will cause them to lose influence with the 2s, normies, which is their main aim. The problem is that by destroying the 4s, with whom 3s actually have more in common, they also eliminate the people who would actually contribute to a decisive victory for the right. The left, on the other hand, is successful because it doesn't throw its most extreme elements to the wolves. Instead, it sees them as useful tools for advancing its cause. They are the hinge that swings the Overton window left and opens the door for progress by more moderate leftists. Nancy Pelosi had a strong personal distaste for AOC, for example, but never tried to destroy her publicly. Unlike the right, the left embraces a no enemies on the left strategy and is largely victorious because of it. The Reformed camp, let's call the majority 3s, has often followed the Buckley-esque instinct to distance itself from and or destroy people to its right, 4s. Why? Because its goal is to gain approval with the people to its left, 2s, the ones who guard access to larger platforms. They always do this while claiming, like Dreher, that they're converting the normies. People to the right, fours, are considered flight risks because their edginess jeopardizes the threes' ability to partner with twos. This is why when the TGC crowd talks about winsomeness, they only mean being winsome to their left, not to their right. In their view, danger to their camp basically always comes from the right. This is also why Kevin DeYoung would actively try to create a poisonous gas cloud around Doug Wilson with his article on Culture War, Doug Wilson and the Moscow Mood. This also helps explain what has been going on in Reformed camps for the past few years after COVID. There's been a major shift. With the fall of many Big Eva players, threes, from prominence, former fours have switched seats with the threes because they saw an open door to larger platforms they previously had no access to. As Wilson noted about his own camp in Moscow, the embargo had finally been lifted. In a game of political musical chairs, the formerly edgy fours are now jockeying for seats vacated by the old threes. Their message has shifted and softened. In turn, a new four has emerged on the right, and the new threes feel like they have to do something about this because these new fours are a real threat. Moscow, it seems, was an old four that moved to three. In turn, others filled their seats as fours: Webbon, Ogden, Isker, Wolf. Let's call them the new Christian right. Now the threes feel that the fours are too vocal about patriarchy and Christian nationalism, a bit too friendly with historical revisionism concerning World War II, too hostile to the post-war consensus and propositional nationhood, and a touch too antagonistic towards Jewish influence in America and global politics. The threes feel this compromises their chance for mainstream influence on platforms controlled by other twos and soft threes. Wilson said as much in a recent blog in Mayblog when he claimed that anti-Semitic elements to his right would potentially compromise Pete Hegseth's confirmation as Secretary of Defense. Remember, Hegseth is a CREC member and a pro-Israel guy, just like the majority of the Republican Congress. Despite disagreements surrounding some of his views on Israel, the fours in this scenario are not generally opposed to Hegseth, to be clear. Most are actively in support of his confirmation. The point to see is the pattern. Gatekeeping the more radical fours out of concern for mainstream, centrist, left-approved acceptance for those on the right. This same concern is also why Wilson said he had to distance himself from Isker and Webbon over their views on Jewish influence and their intention to do a podcast series against Zionism and dispensationalism that Wilson considered unwise. To the threes, the primary danger is to the right. This framework helps explain why the new threes have been going so hard at the fours over the last couple of years. When Pastor Webbon, 4, didn't put a church member under church discipline for sharing a meme in the summer of 2024, prominent pastors, 3s, turned it into a public spectacle. Rather than dealing with it behind closed doors, it was widely publicized. Eric and I, 4s, were specifically and publicly smeared by Tobias Reimenschneider as leaders of an anti-Semitic and racist movement in America, along with Joel, who was also called a Revoice for Nazis leader on CrossPolitic. Videos were made by both sides, and a street brawl among the 3s and 4s broke out on X. This is a working theory, of course, and can't be stretched too far, but it is a theory that has some substance to it. We really do have to ask, are Buckley's instincts still alive and well on the right today? Are these same tactics being used in an ongoing intramural reform debate? In an April 2022 blog in Mayblog, Doug Wilson sang the praises of Buckley, whom he listed as one of the most influential men to have shaped his life. He said that he had been reading National Review for 53 years, since he was in high school. Of Buckley's style of cultural engagement and writing, Wilson said, quote, "I really want to fight that way, and I never want to forget where I first learned it," end quote. However warranted you may think it is, Wilson, like Buckley, has been convinced that his camp has a widespread anti-Semitism problem. The same could be said of Nazism. The problem is that this has never been demonstrated, let alone carefully defined, so that it could be demonstrated. What evidence has been given? So far, they've pointed to one churchman in Webbon's church who, by the way, has said explicitly that he does not hate the Jews and has even repented of previous off-color comments made privately. It's important to note that it was the supposed Revoice for Nazis pastor, Joel Webbon, who actually pastored this young man through these issues effectively. Additionally, there was a White Boy Summer video that showed the lighting of the torch from the 1936 Olympics and other Nazi or Nazi-adjacent imagery. While we too would offer critiques about some of the images used, it hardly demonstrates a widespread problem or actual ethnic hatred, particularly when most of those who shared it, including me by the way, didn't even notice the imagery in the first place. In any case, Wilson and James White have made a concerted effort to publicly and relentlessly call out White Boy Summer, or as they call it, variously White Boy Dumber, White Soy Bummer, non-meme lords, and even certain pastors like Joel Webbon and us. I suppose for allegedly sympathizing with neo-Nazi content, which none of us do, by the way. Eric found himself in the crosshairs for retweeting something Aristotle said about the negative effects of multiculturalism on democracy. Putting a bow on the messaging, Wilson literally lit a prop bridge on fire in his recent No Quarter November video, a bridge emblazoned with a sign reading White Boy Dumber, indicating his apparent desire to burn the bridge once and for all between himself and anyone who enjoys the pit vipers and campy memes of the White Boy Summer crew. Wilson clearly thinks that anti-Semitism is a threat to the Reformed Church and, like cancer, must be cut out. White, for his part, has said that men who traffic in dark MAGA profile pictures, put too much stock in Jewish influence, and entertain alt-right histories of World War II are beyond pastoral shepherding. As I mentioned a moment ago, a big problem embedded in this discussion is that anti-Semitism, like racism, has never been well defined or demonstrated at a wide scale. Even in the Moscow camp, it's been defined in different but still unsatisfactory ways. In his book, American Milk and Honey, Wilson defines anti-Semitism as, quote, the notion that Jews are uniquely malevolent and destructive in their cultural, economic, and political influence in the world. It is not anti-Semitism to believe that Jews are sinful, but anti-Semitism does believe that Jews are uniquely sinful and particularly destructive, end quote. One problem with this definition of anti-Semitism is that the scriptures themselves speak of the Jews, who received God's revelation but rejected it, as being particularly hostile to Christ and his kingdom. Paul, for example, told the Thessalonian church that they, quote, suffered the same things from your own countrymen as they did from the Jews, who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out and displease God and oppose all mankind. 1 Thessalonians 2, 14-16. Likewise, in Ezekiel 5, the prophet says, quote, and Judah hath changed my judgments into wickedness more than the nations, for they have refused my judgments and my statutes, end quote. The point is that Scripture often speaks of degrees of wickedness with different peoples, and a greater degree of hardened wickedness is ascribed to those who reject God's special revelation. Thus, it is completely inconsistent with Scripture to say that assigning a greater or even unique degree of wickedness to a certain people is sinful. Between Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism, only Judaism blasphemously claims that Jesus is burning in hell in a vat of excrement and that Mary is a harlot. The phrase uniquely malevolent doesn't seem to me to be particularly controversial in light of politically incorrect facts such as this. Think about this for a moment. When Buckley charged Buchanan with anti-Semitism, for example, it clearly had nothing to do with supposed sinful partiality in a biblical sense, but more to do with Buchanan's America First foreign policy and recognition of Israel's powerful lobby in Congress and the policies that lobby promoted, which is, by the way, completely true, as was confirmed last summer by Thomas Massey, among others. Wilson has said that laughing at certain kinds of memes reveals dark sulfur in the heart. But the truthfulness of that claim has not been demonstrated from Scripture or elsewhere, only asserted or assumed. We should not be assigning hateful motives in such cases without good evidence. Further, if we are sinning by assigning malevolent characteristics as generalities to certain groups, how was the Apostle Paul justified in saying that Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons? The same could be said of accusations related to so-called Nazism. The left, after all, has been telling us that Trump is literally Hitler for years. What does that accusation even mean? It's an attempted character assassination, plain as day. The reality is, we have not seen a surge of folks trying to resurrect a defunct political party from the 1940s. We certainly aren't Nazis here in Ogden. Not a single one has been found yet, and we've searched our whole building at least twice. Likewise, none of our friends are Nazis to our awareness. So what does the Moscow contingent mean when they say Webbon is doing the Revoice for Nazis thing? What makes a person a Nazi today? This has, again, never been clearly defined, and yet it is being weaponized to destroy the reputations of good Christian men and pastors. Now, to get ahead of a few common objections before we continue, it's worth noting that none of those present in this room here are fatherless basement dwellers with daddy issues. We do not believe Jewish involvement in the pornography industry excuses even one white person who sinfully indulges in those wares, nor does Jewish influence in Hollywood excuse even one person for enjoying the Twilight movies. Another way of putting it would be that we don't believe every problem on earth finds its genesis in the Jews, or that the involvement of Jews in any actual problem exonerates anyone else from responsibility concerning their own problems. Everyone must answer for his own sins. Further, we are not envious of the Jews for their high performance in the economic or political arenas and merely emoting at them from a position of culpable inferiority, nor are we seething with malice and genocidal hatred toward them. We believe that Jews may be truly converted to Christ, forsake the idols and sinful ways of their forefathers, and come into the kingdom. We don't believe these issues depend on a particular view of the future conversion of the Jewish peoples or its preterist alternative. Finally, we would most definitely discipline anyone in our church who exhibited sociopathic behavior related to puppy torture. Even so, the problem remains. If Woke Wars 1.0 was about systemic racism and the racism hidden in the deep recesses of every white person's heart on a supposedly structural level, Woke Wars 2.0 is about doing the same thing with anti-Semitism. You don't have to actually demonstrate real hatred toward Jews. You simply have to laugh at the wrong meme or think the wrong thoughts about the historical narrative. In that case, we're doing little more than policing ill-defined thought crimes in ways that does little more than serve to reinforce the left's framing of all of these issues. You are allowed to notice Jewish influence, according to Wilson, but you aren't allowed to attribute to it what E. Michael Jones has called the Jewish revolutionary spirit or any other kind of malevolence. Yuri Brito, presiding minister of the CRAC, said on X that different kinds of noticing aren't equal, and some noticing related to Hitler, quote, immediately places us in an existential position of hatred toward an entire people group, end quote. In other words, the lines between noticing and possessing seething hatred are unclear. On the Chris Arnzen show, a Scottish pastor said that, quote, even if you say you don't hate the Jews, we know that you still hate the Jews, end quote. How can a man even defend himself against such a self-contradictory and unfalsifiable charge? Now, I've previously called some of the tactics at play the poison gas cloud fallacy, a rhetorical pattern I believe is driving a significant amount of discord at the moment on many of these issues. The fallacy goes like this. Person A says something about the Jews or the Talmud that is clear, true, and relevant to our times and culture, but it's outside the Overton window of discussion on the topic. Person B responds with something that is also true in a general sense, typically a warning against sinful behavior or some sinful inward condition toward the Jews, but which is, at the least, implying that person A is likely guilty of this sinful behavior merely for saying the true thing they said. Importantly, they never demonstrate this guilt in person A. The result is that person B has dropped a poison gas cloud over person A, implying that person A is a sinful anti-Semite, seething with Jew hatred, and perhaps a side order of crackling envy. But they've done this in a plausibly deniable way, which always allows the retreating move, oh, I never said that you were an anti-Semite. I was just warning about it generally. But it is kind of odd that you're getting pretty defensive right now about it. In fact, such defensiveness strikes me as the kind of response an anti-Semite would give. Now, interestingly, you can currently swap out Jews for women, an anti-Semite for misogynist, and get largely the same result. You could also swap out Jews for insert other race, an anti-Semite for racist, and get the same result. This is the kind of thing that makes me think that we're dealing with the blasphemy laws that typically surround an idol in at least some of this debate. Instead of these tactics, we need to practice the courtesy of specificity when it comes to accusations and public controversy among brothers. If you have a problem with someone, if you believe that they hold a sinful or erroneous belief that is appropriate to address publicly, then it's helpful to name the person, describe what you believe their position to be in terms you think they would affirm, and then explain why you believe them to be in error. I call this a courtesy because it allows the person you are disagreeing with to defend themselves. They can change their mind, persuaded by your argument. They can disagree, providing counter arguments. They could even call you names and dismiss you altogether, I suppose. That would be their prerogative. But you have provided them with the courtesy of specificity rather than casting a plausibly deniable poison gas cloud over them and everyone associated with them. To be clear, we do think that there are elements on the right that should certainly be dealt with in this kind of specific and intellectually rigorous manner. We're Christians, and that certainly means that sin must be dealt with biblically and thoroughly. It also means that we ought to care about truth, whether that be historical, theological, sociological, political, interpersonal, ecclesiastical, or any other category of truth. The disagreement right now generally concerns the scope of certain problems and how those problems should be dealt with. There really is some sinful stuff floating around X from bona fide Absaloms, and our young men should be warned about it. But it seems to us that the scope of these things is being wildly exaggerated. In our pastoral experience, we've never had to counsel a single person about a case of actual ethnic hatred or malice, despite wide-ranging discussions of many of these topics with literally hundreds of churchmen over the years. Knowing a thing or two about podcast downloads and audience size, the reach of something like the Stone Choir podcast, for example, is relatively narrow when compared to this or other podcasts we make here at New Christendom Press. And where we've spoken with people who listen to the podcast, by far the most common refrain has been something to the effect of, some of what they say is interesting and has caused me to dig into different sources, but I disagree with this or that aspect of their shows and certainly have been turned off by their social media posts. Speaking of Stone Choir, it would probably be helpful to make an application of some of the things I've just explained. If the problem is Stone Choir, as is often claimed when these questions are pressed, it's entirely inappropriate to go after Pastor Webbon by proxy, particularly when Pastor Webbon has actively warned his people about aspects of their specific content. Name them, Stone Choir, accurately describe the positions they're publicly defending in a way you believe they would affirm, and then present robust arguments contradicting those claims. But certainly don't make a vague cartoon caricature of their position that ends up seeming to describe everyone from guys who like white boy summer memes to actual skinheads intent on genociding non-whites as if they're in the same tribe. Be specific. Name names. Give others the courtesy to defend or clarify their positions. Don't make it seem as if there are only two possible camps. Camp 1, people who agree with my exact framing of every question related to World War II, the Jews, the post-war consensus, anti-Semitism, etc. And Camp 2, the fatherless Nazis with hearts full of Jew hate. If you really want to burn the bridge between your community and Stone Choir, then don't label the bridge you set aflame something much, much broader, like, for example, White Boy Dumber. After all, which is more prevalent in our culture today? Anti-white policy, propaganda, and prejudice? Carefully cultivated white self-hatred? Or actual Nazis trying to find the Fuhrer somewhere in Argentina? We can't forget what old Jack said about fire extinguishers and floods. Additionally, if you disagree with Webbon's pastoral strategy in dealing with young right-wing men, shouldn't that be an in-house discussion rather than a public spat? As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, we shouldn't parade our conflicts out into the pagan courts, and that includes the court of public opinion. Regardless of intention, this attempt to publicly purge the reformed world of alleged anti-Semitism has not united forces for the rebuilding of Christendom. Instead, the net result has been increased infighting and discord among good Christian brothers. It has led to an incredibly foolish and unnecessarily divisive cold civil war. We've spoken about this kind of intramural reformed pugilism before, including our recent episode entitled No More Brother Wars, and we'd stand by the points made in that episode. At this point, it would be helpful to offer some of our thoughts about the Antioch Declaration, its context, and some of our issues with it. After months of feuding between various camps, the Antioch Declaration was released in November. While the drafters of the Declaration claimed it was a completely separate matter from the ongoing conflict, the document not only addressed all the issues at the heart of the various disagreements, it also featured the same collaborators who had been publicly opposing Pastor Webbon. Not a single member of the camp with allegedly opposing views was invited to the table for discussion, which is odd if you want to call something a consensus document. It's obvious that the declaration and the conflict were part of the same storyline with the same purpose of purging the camp of alleged anti-Semites. Blaze commentator Orrin McIntyre, who had watched the debacle from afar, described the public declaration as an ill-conceived purity test of the highest order. He said he was incredibly disappointed to see an in-camp dispute from the right turned into a public shamefest and called it absolute loser behavior and disgusting. The point of such actions, he said, was clearly to shame people into agreement by exposing them to public ridicule. This is a common strategy of the left and shouldn't have a place among Christians. As Pastor Wilson once wrote concerning Buckley, quote, "We're in the thick of a desperate fight, but we need to fight like cavaliers and not like thugs. Never like thugs. We need to be light horse cavalry, not an armored tank division." People justify fighting in thuggish ways because they say that the situation is dire. They say that we cannot afford the niceties. And so it is dire, and the niceties can seem absurd. But we need to understand that in situations like ours, the cavaliers are far more deadly than the thugs, end quote. We agree. We should not be fighting like thugs or political apparatchiks. Now, there's a long history behind the document and its collaborators. More on that later in this episode. But at the end of the day, it represents one right-wing group, threes, unable to build consensus with or force conformity on another group, fours, within its own ruling mechanisms. That same group of threes then took the document and all its baggage public in an attempt to consolidate loyalties and purge opponents from its own ranks. This is fundamentally a Buckley-esque maneuver. Whatever the intent, the declaration set off a powder keg of growing hostilities within the Reformed camp. As McIntyre pointed out, if you win this way, you win with Saul Alinsky-style tactics. You win fundamentally by bowing the knee to the left's framing. Congratulations, he said. The left thought you were the safest option. They will allow you to have a platform because you pose no threat to them. You are now owned by them. The cost? Burning your own popsicle stick village to the ground, bridges and all. As we said earlier, correction and consensus must happen within the camp. There are real problems and we have to deal with them. But we should not be trying to settle in-house disputes by appealing to leftist cancel strategies and poison gas cloud techniques. We have to be able to make friend-enemy distinctions, not gas bomb entire villages full of innocents to make our point. We'll win by handling things within the camp, proving that our internal polity is capable of handling such disputes. Doxing is absolute loser behavior, and it really needs to stop. You may ask then, why we're addressing this publicly. The answer is simple. Our good name and that of our friend Joel has been maligned, and we believe we have a right to give a public defense. When you have good evidence that people are warning about you privately and via whisper campaigns, as well as making claims about you publicly, for example, the one that Eric and I are leaders of a racist and anti-Semitic movement, the only way to clear your name is with a public response, since you can't possibly know how far the whispers have spread and state your case individually to all involved parties. Now, we've done our best to stay out of this publicly, in hopes that Christian brothers would come to a peaceful resolution. We've called both sides to conduct themselves more respectfully, but that hasn't seemed to happen. We've been in contact with Moscow, James White, and Tobias privately, and have intentionally sought peace as well as an airing of our specific concerns. That will continue, but sadly, this has not brought an end to the conflict or the efforts to damage the reputations of good men and faithful pastors. At the very least, we're convinced that these public matters require our public clarifications and statements of issues. As we asked for earlier, we've tried to be specific about where we have problems and with whom, such that those men may defend themselves publicly. Our claims are falsifiable and disputable. We may be wrong, and we've certainly been wrong before. So no, this is also a pastoral issue for us. We've benefited richly from our brothers in Moscow, as have our people. But this public dispute has brought serious accusations about us in public, which has in turn led to confusion among our own congregation about what we believe. We've had dozens of phone calls and messages from people around the country asking variations of the question, "It seems like Pastor Wilson thinks you guys are racist and anti-Semites. Are you?" And given these things, the need arose for this kind of episode and public engagement with these questions. We know that many of you are frankly tired of talking about this situation. And you know what? We are too. Many people are caught in the middle. Many friends of ours, they've asked us, I like them and I like you. Why is there so much infighting? It's draining just keeping up with all the latest details of a public feud or to unravel its lengthy backstory. We get it. It's our hope that this episode will provide you with the clarity you need so that we can all return to the great work of building that's set before each one of us. To that end, in this episode of the King's Hall podcast, we'll address some important issues, including the Antioch Declaration and what we consider to be the public smear campaign against us and our friend, Pastor Joel Webbon. But more than that, we want to call you to something far greater, and that is the work of building the new Christendom, a work of lasting legacy far beyond the petty issues of any online moment. We have building to do. There's no time to come down from the good work to answer every Sanballat, Tobias, and Gashmu. We'll continue to fight for the unity of the body of Christ. Brothers, there's never been a better time to build. So let's get to work. The future's never been brighter. The King's Hall podcast exists to make self-ruled men who rule well and win the world.
Gentlemen, welcome to this episode of the King's Hall podcast, joined by we three kings, not of Orient are. We have the Viking, Mr. Dan Burkholder.
Yes.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Eric.
You know what, Dan? It's good to have you. We also have Brian Sauvé.
It's good to be here, Eric.
The sweet psalmist of Ogden.
I would take. I'll take it. And you know what else we've got? We've got Eric Kahn, the sweet pugilist of Ogden. I don't know.
Rabble rouser.
Sweet might not be the word that some people would use to describe me.
Really, let's just say the sweetheart of Ogden.
Yeah, that's right. Brian, in this episode, obviously, we're going to deal with some weighty issues that have been going on in the Reformed camp. But first, we need to let our listeners know that the world is not just stuff.
It's definitely not just stuff. Confirmed. New book has, you can buy this right now. You can.
I think we're past, by the time this airs, we'll be past the get it for Christmas.
Yeah, it'll be a little bit after Christmas, if you ordered it the day this came out. But I would still do it. I would head personally, if it was me, to newchristendompress.com/cosmos, and I would pick up Haunted Cosmos, Doing Your Duty in a World That's Not Just Stuff, so that I could learn about the taxonomy of God's seen and unseen world and how to do my duty in it. That's what I would. That's just one guy's opinion.
Guy's opinion. Can people still get a signed copy of the book?
Wow. If you ask really nicely and you buy a book, and then what I'll say is buy a book and then come to the New Christendom Press conference in June, bring it with you, and then probably, yeah.
Maybe I will sign the book.
Yeah.
Dan,
Eric will sign it for you.
This is one of your favorite books of all time. And you've read every sentence.
Here's what I will say about it. It is not turgid and pointless student term papers. It does not read that way.
Yeah, wow.
Thank you, Dan. High praise.
That is high praise.
It's not the worst thing ever written.
Well, gentlemen, as we jump into this discussion, obviously we had a slightly longer cold open than normal.
40 minutes longer.
We're aiming for the Haunted Cosmos length.
Yeah.
Writing from, Deacon Ben Garrett.
That's when Deacon Ben Garrett tells a story, he takes his time.
We looked at William F. Buckley Jr. and sort of what typically goes on in the conservative movement. Mark Twain said something I think is connected to this. He said, history doesn't repeat, but it does often rhyme. Do you guys still see this tendency on the right happening today? Gatekeeping the right. Dan, we'll start with you because your big brain and your brilliance.
Wow. Thank you, Eric. I know this is a serious conversation, so I take your compliments to heart.
Good.
Yes, absolutely. We still see the gatekeeping on the right. This has been a problem historically. You see this with the Buckley story that we told, but this has really been... especially in modern conservatism, which is kind of an ironic statement when you think about it. But in modern conservatism or in the modern conservatism movement, you see this gatekeeping is often detrimental to actually taking power and wielding it for the good of the people, to punish your enemies, But the left has no problem in doing that. And we've seen that especially highlighted since 2020, to where if you didn't do what the left said, then you would absolutely be punished. They would ruin you. They would end your career. You were labeled as a murderer for not taking certain substances inside your body or not wearing certain articles of clothing on your face. And so we see that in the left. They have no problem with wielding power to actually punish their enemies. And they even know how to use their radicals. Like Nancy Pelosi and AOC. Nancy Pelosi does not like AOC, from what I understand. I haven't had personal conversations with her. But you don't see her publicly criticizing AOC. The Green New Deal that AOC was a contributor for some years ago, you didn't see the Democrats, the leftists, come out and say, yeah, I mean, some of it's good, but most of it is complete garbage. I don't think the world is actually going to end because of methane gas from cattle, right? It was useful to them to push the Overton window. But on the right, it doesn't seem like we have the same stomach for utilizing power in the way that the left does. And so often you see that gatekeeping by taking the farthest right elements, some of them problematic, some of them actually really good and courageous men that are actually willing to push the Overton window, and instead the allure of the power and the money of the left, who holds most of the power in the media and in institutions and in the government and things like that. The allure is too much. And so instead of pushing the Overton window in the way that the left does, the right has determined, the soft middle right has determined that power and having a seat at the table is a worthy compromise than it is to push the Overton window and to actually gain power that you would actually wield against your opponents who are wicked, and to punish or to reward your friends. So yes, absolutely, that's still happening. It's an anomaly right now, particularly with the Trump administration, but we've even seen cracks of that with some of his more recent nominations for some of his cabinet, to where he seems to be throwing some bones back to the left. But that wasn't the case immediately when he was elected. So I don't know if you guys have seen the same thing or if you'd push back on any of that, but that's what I see.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, particularly like we reference Murray Rothbard, but even in the early 90s when he was describing the old right, so before the 1950s, it used to be not a monolith, but it was a very diverse group of thinkers. The things that they held in common were things you typically are the radical right now. So things like opposing FDR's New Deal, getting away from a welfare state. Actually, they were talking a lot about things like ending the Fed, getting back to some sort of like gold-based currency, stuff like that. But then over time, it was just, we're going to weed all those elements out. The 80s, really, Buckley opened the door for neoconservatism. And I think as a whole, Brian, it weakened the movement. It's interesting to me, though, as we've read the history and gone through it, you sort of, and I want to get your take on this, but I've sort of had this kind of recognition of like, wow, none of this stuff is actually new. And readers of scripture and people who love history, there's nothing new under the sun. We should really believe that. But just kind of how does it help us understand the moment looking back at the past in that way?
Yeah, we have to understand, like you said, history doesn't always repeat, but it does rhyme. When we look at, whether it's a large swath of history or the history of a nation or the history of some specific influential person all the way down to that, you'll often notice patterns that do repeat in other figures and movements, and you learn political tactics, and all of a sudden you say, oh, that was kind of Machiavellian before Machiavelli. That was, like you start to notice patterns. And it can be, there's a danger there where you can, all of a sudden you're a hammer that sees a nail everywhere. Like you discover something, you're like, oh, everything's driven by envy. And then lo and behold, everywhere I look, I see envy. It's right. All, there's a danger there as well. But in this particular case, with the story in the cold open and some of the background of the old right and the neocon movement, it's important not just for the patterns we see repeating today in terms of the left's playbook and how the left has successfully gotten the left to gatekeep the right and the right to gatekeep the right, while nobody gatekeeps the left. We also have to understand that this isn't just an old story that rhymes with current events, but current events are a continuation, another chapter in the same book.
Right.
So we're where we are today politically in the state of the right wing, the state of the left wing, because of this story. We're still in it, is another way of putting it. Like, Pat Buchanan isn't ancient history.
No.
Pat Buchanan is like 2000s writing some of the most influential books on some of these subjects. And
Death of the West.
Yeah, Death of the West, which I'm reading right now. And it's making me want to reproduce just frankly irresponsibly.
That's great. Well, yeah, and one of the interesting things that I found in a lot of the research and talking to older guys who've been around this movement forever, things like the neoconservative movement is filled with really like Trotskyites. We mentioned this. Somebody asked me why on X I referred to the neoconservatives as the Trotskyite right. They were anti-Soviet, many of them, and many of them have like basically conversions, politically speaking. But it also helps frame something that's central to this story, which I think is, Buckley wanted to say, I never moved. And Gottfried essentially calls him out on that. He said, you did move. And all the people knew him best said, no, you did actually move. I think for all of us, just being aware that none of this is really static. Like the Dan from today is not the Dan from 10 years ago. So nobody, I think, actually honestly can say, I've never moved on anything. And certainly I think, Doug has said this before, but the fall of Big Eva and the embargo being lifted, situations change. And it seems like the wise thing, Dan, would be to recognize, okay, we always have to be going back and saying, what are my principles? Any of us could be tempted to change based on external circumstances. So how do you think through that in terms of maintaining principle in a world that is dynamic? It's changing.
Yeah, well, I think that it's really important. Something that we've had to discuss internally. As you get success, you have more opportunity, right? And so it's more important. Obviously, if you don't have success and there's not opportunity, your principles aren't really tested, because you can have your principles all to yourself and you don't really have any challenge to them. But as you gain more success and more opportunity, then your principles really are challenged, because there are going to be times when you're asked to sacrifice your principles, maybe for something that is sold to you as the greater good or something like that. But as soon as you lose your principles, you actually lose your distinctiveness, the thing that actually got you to where you are. And so that's one of the things that we all have to be aware of, is that as these opportunities come, that you actually maintain your principles. And it also tests your principles to make sure that they're the right principles, the right vision for the future. And so that's more of an ethereal comment, but it is actually quite important when you start applying it to what you do on a day-to-day basis. So if you look at, I'll just use us for an example. If you look at what we're doing, with the school and the church, New Christendom Press, there are other businesses that we're involved in, or businesses that our church members are starting or have success in. As more opportunities come, and you have, like, for example, maybe a bigger platform, you could actually have a show on some of the mainstream conservative platforms, but you just can't talk about X, Y, or Z, or you have to punch back at X, Y, or Z. And make sure that you gatekeep, these people on your right, because they could be a real problem to your platform. Though that's where your principles are actually tested. And when you actually have to examine, what is my vision for the future? What does God say in his word? And what are the hills that I have to die on? And so these are some of the things that you definitely have to look at when you're moving, because you would hope that when you're moving, as you said, like the Dan of 10 years ago is not the Dan of today. That's 100% true. The Dan of 10 years ago didn't have any kids. The Dan of 10 years ago had to repent of not having any children. And so the way I view the world, the way I view the future, what I'm working for, everything that exists within me, not to make this all about me, but has actually changed to a degree. The foundational faith, my theological stances and things like that have remained relatively similar with some changes.
But I guess the hope would be that you're going deeper into your principles.
Exactly. Yep. Further up and further in. Exactly. Yep. And as you mature and as you grow and you get clarity, you sharpen your vision, you sharpen your principles to be a man that's actually unwavering in those principles, that will not bow to any pressure to waver on your principles, to capitulate, to the culture or to whomever is asking you to change. We talk about the leftist gaze, the allowable narrative, the things that you can talk about and the things you can't talk about. And why do those things exist? Well, a man of principle doesn't really care. A man of principle doesn't care what the leftists think, what their enemies perceive them as long as they're acting righteously, with that vision in mind, a biblical vision of the future. They should just build and just say, you know what? I don't have time to come down from the wall. The work is too great.
Yeah, it's interesting, Brian. I want to ask you this because it's related to something in the cold open. Speaking of like pressures to change on certain issues, you mentioned that kind of this idea of like when you find an idol, there become all these attendant blasphemy laws that are attached to it. It seems like if you're talking about the Jews, if you're talking about historical questions about World War II, like, for example, if we go back and we question the history of the Battle of Vienna in 1683, nobody cares. But it seems like particularly there's a list of subjects right now that you can get in a lot of trouble, whether it's a historical question, whether you're trying to determine like, genealogical questions about the Jews, whatever. I know that as you delve into them on social media, you have the sense that you're like, are we walking on thin ice here? Because culturally it's so unacceptable. So my question for you is, how do you think through, okay, does that mean we just shouldn't address those things?
Yeah.
We certainly have to make value judgments on, importance level that we put on them. But how do you think through that?
I mean, you do have to be quite careful and precise in how you're thinking through some of these things. So give you some examples, and like one of the fallacies I think can come into play that we see played out, and we all have to be aware of. You think about the transgenderism and some of the sexual madness and gender madness that's been ascendant in the last 20 years. Really, it goes back quite a bit further than that, to Gramscian Marxist strategy to undermine the natural family and kind of slowly march through the institutions to dissolve the Christianity of the West to make them a conquerable foe to some modified form of communism or socialism. So that's the long play. But when you think about what that's been like experientially for us, it meant that when you're an 11th grader in public school, as I was, and you maybe want to notice something about the difference between men and women and their strength or something like that, and say like, I really, the Air Force or the Marines or whatever, they just kind of said, let's open up standards to allow women to serve in combat in certain roles or things like that. And you might want to notice, well, but hang on, women aren't strong in the way men are strong physically. They don't seem to be suited in their nature to combat. Maybe you don't even cite a Bible verse, but you're just noticing sort of there's a check in you that knows and it's sometimes visible, sometimes invisible, sometimes opaque, sometimes transparent. You know that you've been discipled to be careful about saying something like that out loud. And in that case, there really is a blasphemy law operating, which is egalitarianism and feminism, where we're trying to dissolve all distinctions of hierarchy, because hierarchy is highly problematic to a Marxist worldview or a worldview that's attempting to flatten everything. So it's like, one big, I've said before, and all the Kansans get mad at me, to make everything like one big Kansas. Sorry, guys. Nebraska's flat too. One big Nebraska. So there's real blasphemy laws operating there. You could give many, many examples of this, where the blasphemy laws are surrounding an idol or an opposing ideology, a god and his opposing ideology. Now, we do need to be careful, though, of what I've seen called the YouTube commenter fallacy, which is that it's basically a two-step argument. And it's, imagine somebody commenting on YouTube, and in the first pane of the meme, they notice, whenever I say the truth about such and such subject, everybody gets mad at me. And so then in the second pane, they conclude, and this is fallaciously, they conclude, therefore, anytime anybody is mad at me or pushes back against something I say, I must be right, which is not actually true. You can say something dumb and also have people mad at you or disagree with you. And I bring that up because what that then requires is that we have sobriety when we approach these issues, and we have to be thinking in terms of truth. So we talked in the cold open about steel manning your opponents. We called it the courtesy of specificity, but that's basically just steel manning, which is it's for your opponent, but it's also for you. Because when you're able to present somebody else's argument in a way you think they would agree with, that is what I'm saying. And then say, okay, and here's why I think you're wrong. Reason. That protects everybody from fallacious, emotional kind of reasoning that's steered by the gaze of some god and its attendant blasphemy laws. Now, what's dangerous about that is that it can lead you into some places that are, let's say, politically incorrect, where you start doing this and you're going down a rabbit hole. And, all of us who went to public school, to the previous illustration, know what this is like. All of a sudden, you're like, the people who are supposed to be teaching me, they actually don't know what they're talking about. Because even when I steel man their position, it's nonsense. It's word salad. It doesn't make sense. It's emotional. It's blustering. It's unfair. It's straw man. It's not driven by reason. It's not driven by data. It's not internally consistent, or it's not coherent and consistent with the external world. It's valid but unsound. It's invalid and unsound. Like, you start going through that, and that puts you in a dangerous place where you can be in a position to be the guy that's like, I think that this thing is true, and yet I know if I say that it is true, many people will want to not just disagree with me, but destroy me by any means possible.
Right.
So there's like landmines all around, and it calls for sobriety. I think it calls for care.
Well, don't you think there's a point here about Christians should argue a certain way? So Doug has made this point in the past, like, you want to steel man your opponent, meaning you put his argument in terms that he would agree with, right? So you fairly represent. This kind of goes to the gas cloud fallacy, as we've called it. One of the other things I've seen in play, we've kind of described as like a Kafka trap. This is a logical fallacy that occurs when someone is accused of something and their defense is used as evidence of their guilt. So I actually found this helpful. J.D. Hall had posted this on Twitter, and he said, I've seen this argument in Woke Wars 1, and it seems like it's being used again. So he says, step 1, call someone a racist, bigot, or anti-Semite. Step 2, say whatever you want about them, no matter how dishonest, because that's how you're allowed to treat racists, bigots, and anti-Semites. Step 3, when you're called out for this, ask why they're defending racism, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. So these are, I think, variations. They're not all the same thing. But the Kafka trap is a little bit the same way. Like, I know that you're seething with hatred or crackling with envy, and the best way to identify someone who has that envy is they'll deny it. So then you're like, well, if I deny it, it just, in their way they set up the argument, well, then I'm guilty of it. It seems like, Brian, now asking about the gas cloud fallacy.
Yeah.
Why would this be particularly harmful? I mean, just thinking about Christian communities and Christian brothers, I guess 2 questions. Why is it harmful, and where have you kind of seen this happen?
So it's harmful because one of the things that it doesn't allow for is actually robust debate about things that can be somewhat nuanced or have multiple layers to them. One of the issues with some of the framing I've seen around, as an example, around the anti-Semitism charges, is that number one, the argument itself, we just have to admit, as uncomfortable as it is, because of the wiring we've all received from our cultural upbringing, just the stuff in the air, is that arguments about racism and anti-Semitism are left framed to begin with.
Yeah.
You're in stepping into those debates and treating them as existential threats, and as like one of the most serious things that's happening in the world today is there's a bunch of white racists going around who are going to destroy everything. That is the leftist frame. It's why we brought up remember old Jack, C.S. Lewis, and what he said about fire extinguishers and floods. If you look at our culture today, and you were just to ask on an objective level, what are some of the biggest problems related to race, ethnos, all of these various tangled nest of problems? What is a bigger problem? White people, heritage Americans, however you want to put it, being taught to hate themselves and consider themselves as entrenched, structurally racist people destroying the world, who come from evil people, who that have a kind of privilege that was built on the back of black evils. Or is a bigger problem that white people are likely to, in sinful ways, go out and mistreat blacks, Latino, some other races or ethnicities out in the world. And I would argue that it's not even close. The far, far bigger problem, you just read a book like Jeremy Carl's Unprotected Class. I got that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That
something in my head
prevalent.
It's very prevalent. So one of the problems right now with the poison gas fallacy, the imprecision, is that one of the things it's trying to do is adopt this left-framed gatekeeping of a conversation itself. And what you're fundamentally doing, I think I see this a lot out of Doug's work in American Milk and Honey and some of the conversations surrounding this, are that what it amounts to is to say, you have to adopt my definitions on the definitional level. You have to adopt my arguments, or you are very likely one of these anti-Semitic or in danger of being anti-Semitic, black-hearted, seething kind of person. And so the tactic is like dropping a big gas cloud that's sort of imprecise in its defining characteristics over a whole conversation. And the tactic is flee the gas cloud to the only acceptable position in the debate,
right,
which is mine. And if you don't, then I'm not saying you're an anti-Semite, but you probably are. Or you're
somehow sympathetic.
So the problem with this is it's not precise enough, and it doesn't allow for genuine disagreement on the definitional level to actually say, like as we did in the cold open, well hang on. Some of this language on the defining level you're proving too much. It's too broad. Other people have raised these criticisms of his work as well.
But I think even like Joe Sobrin's point that we talked about was that in the West, one of the defining characteristics of our legal system, I think as it accords with the Ten Commandments and witness bearing, is that we should be precise in defining crimes and sins. But one of the tactics of the left is let's define them very loosely so we have a lot of power to condemn people. And then people go around in this existential dread. Well, I don't want to be called that, so I need to stay away from any list of topics that are even associated. One of the other things I think that's interesting, and we'll probably at some point, I think, do a more in-depth review on, say, like American Milk and Honey, some of the things we disagree with. But one of the things Doug says in there is he said, I think the Christian position on the Holocaust should be X, Y, and Z. And again, I think it's a blurring of categories where you're like, wait, I didn't realize there was a Christian position, like an orthodox position, in other words, on a historical narrative. Well, that really makes people, to Brian's point, I think, like, you're like, wow, I really don't want to question too much about the historical narrative, because it sounds like if I do, I no longer have the quote unquote Christian position.
One of the things that happens is that the further distance you get from an event, the more cartoonized often our recollections of it become. And this is just natural. You come to historical or scholarly consensus that's based on the conversations happened for a long time. And so people develop, like, the Crusades are a good example of this. One of the reasons we went through them and have gone through many elements of the Crusades and saying, well, the cartoonized version of the Crusades that the West basically adopted in its own self-reflection concerning its Christian tradition and history was to say the Crusades were unjustified wars of aggression by greedy Christians who were just going and destroying peaceful Muslims who were just trying to invent calculus, and we just wouldn't leave them alone.
Yeah.
And so we committed atrocities, and oh, by the way, against a lot of Jews along the way. Now, Christians sinned in the Crusades, but the point is that it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And so when you get, again, with the blasphemy laws attending an idol or some sort of ideological blasphemy law issue, when you start to say things like that about any historical event, I'm immediately suspicious. I have a red flag going up in my mind saying, there's something ideological happening here. Mm-hmm. There's something political and ideological that's less based about the actual truth of the events themselves than about the utility of this version of events for political reasons today. So to be clear, people are like, wow, they love the Nazi. No, that's not the point we're making. Isn't to all of a sudden assert our own cartoonized version of World War II that's like, Hitler was an unqualified Christian prince, and the Nazis were unqualifiedly the good guys, and Churchill was just this black-hearted thug who never did anything right, and he secretly tortured puppies in his basement. Like, the point is, No cartoons anywhere. Let's do the difficult work of history, and also just recognize that there's a reason that more than one book is written about any historical event. One of the reasons is because even professional historians disagree about the nature of different events.
Well, that's why even in very brief research on topics like what is the genetic history of the Ashkenazi Jews? Well, like 2 minutes of Google searching, and you'll find this is highly debated. It can often be very contentious. People don't agree. So that in and of itself should kind of be a warning to me when somebody says, this must be your position on the Ashkenazi Jews. And I'm like, well, but even the geneticists, who are many of which are not Christians, even they don't agree with something like that.
One clarification here I think is helpful with an actual example is that when a Christian is doing history, we want the Christian position on a thing really is what truly happened, because Christians believe in truth.
Yeah.
We don't want to believe something false. But you have to distinguish then between different layers of the Christian approach to a thing. The ethical approach to something like, let's take World War II. Christians should all agree, or at least there should be a really robust conversation about the ethics of firebombing civilians, right?
Agreed.
Christians should not be in the business of intentionally murdering women and children in combat. Okay, now that principle I just laid out, first of all, there's a debate that would happen historically concerning the horror of war and the ethical calculation of that claim. That comes into the Crusades, World War I, like all of the wars. All right, but the question I would have that would immediately arise from that on a historical level is then, let's say that we agree, some hypothetical group of Christians and pastors or whatever agreed on that ethical claim I just made. Well, then we would be forced to say the Allies were therefore extremely wicked and sinful in their approach to the war, in firebombing Dresden.
At least at many points.
And the Axis powers were extremely sinful in their actions in rocketing London and blitzkrieg. So we could say something like that. We could also say, as an objective ethical fact, that the Darwinism that was in the air at that time that affected Germany, but also America, England, this absolutely ascendant Darwinism at that time, and its child, which is eugenics, led to some absolute evils and atrocities. For example, Hitler's, I think it's the T4, basically extermination eugenics program, where he ordered, and this is undisputed, where he ordered the liquidation, the murder of 1 million, basically like mental ward patients in Germany. And they had carried out this to the tune of at least hundreds of thousands by the time some church leaders in Germany within the party actually said, hey, you need to stop doing that this is actually just plain murder. And then he halted that program at some point. So we say that's evil. And then we could also say, and all of similar programs like that everywhere in the world that they were, because of this Darwinism in the air, all of those were evil. And what we've just done is some, like, not super complex, but a little bit more complex than a cartoon version of ethical analysis, treating history on its different layers of truth, the historical fact, the ethical fact. And this is the kind of thing that happens when you don't get emotional and try to shut down the whole conversation with left-coded epithets from the beginning. Mm-hmm. You can then have that conversation where people can get in the same room, or they can exchange books, articles, podcasts, whatever, and have a robust debate about some of these topics. But when you see that debate can't even be had, you're not even allowed to have that debate, and anybody having that debate on any level is an anti-Semite or is a racist or is, that screams Saul Alinsky, Gramscian Marxist, left-coded framing that all right-wing people should agree. Let's get rid of that. Let's actually just jettison that whole mode of exchange of ideas.
Yeah, let's at least be able to have a conversation, Daniel.
It is really interesting because if you recall, Doug Wilson, one of his favorite lines for the last, I don't know, however long I've been reading him, was that the war that we're fighting is actually control over the dictionary. And so it is really unhelpful when you define anti-Semitism as loosely as possible, so that even certain forms of noticing, as Yuri Burrito said, are not the same. And so you're actually guilty. What's interesting with this leftist tactic that you were talking about, Brian, is that I actually experienced this firsthand. A lot of us have, especially millennials. I'm graduating from college around the 2008, 2009 time period. And for you Zoomers, the economy was really bad. That was the housing crisis.
Yeah.
It was actually really, unemployment numbers were really high. So I'm getting out of college. I have college loans to pay off, and I'm trying to start a household and all this. And I'm in my college classes, business school. I had to take some HR classes, which is quite unfortunate, but I had to take some HR classes, and you had affirmative action at the time. So they had certain hiring quotas based on race and gender and things like that they had to fulfill. And so even if you graduated with good marks and you had a lot of experience, it didn't necessarily mean that you were going to be the best qualified person for the job because they had to fill their quotas. So that was what I was dealing with at the time. And if you noticed, like, I may or may not have at my public university, that was actually unjust. And it was actually a form of racism. You got a lot of pushback. Like, no, I'm not saying anything bad about any of these people that are within the quotas that they have to fill. But don't you think that we should just hire someone based upon their merit for the position and not necessarily just based upon their skin color? And automatically, because of the loose terms that they're able to control the dictionary and to define things, you're actually a racist for that sort of noticing, because you actually have privilege. And we've seen this played out, time and time again over the years into this self-loathing that is encouraged and shame for just simply being a white person and the privilege that you have, that you don't even understand why you have it, but it's because of that you're actually an oppressor, that you have the privilege that you have. And so you see this trap that was laid out for us, and in that sort of noticing, but it's just being reapplied now in this topic of anti-Semitism, where even certain types of noticing is sinful, and you are the nabal, that Abigail should definitely be warning their pastors against, just because you notice, like in the example that Pastor Sauvé gave about this historical narrative being actually, history is really complex. And so it really is, I think, a war over the dictionary. And so I think that those not being able to define your terms very tightly, but intentionally having the loosest form of a definition you can for a sin is really problematic, to the point where you're saying there are certain pastors that need to step down and certain church members that need to be put under church discipline just for laughing at the wrong thing or noticing the wrong thing.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting thing. It's in American Milk and Honey. I've seen it on the blog, and then Doug has repeated it, like in the Cross Politic episode, where he said the problem is Stone Choir, and then he went on to describe Joel as Revoice for Nazis, and then most of the show is actually about Joel. So it really seems to be a gas cloud kind of attack. But what's interesting about this is you have this dynamic where you're kind of lumping all these things together. You're using pretty charged language. And then there's, as Brian said, there's always kind of an escape hatch of what didn't specifically say. It's kind of like the Buckley, like, what didn't say Buchanan was an anti-Semite? I just said he said and done some anti-Semitic things. As you look at some of this, though, Brian, I do want to specifically ask about the Revoice for Nazis. We talked about that in the episode. What is Revoice, first of all? What's the connotation, denotation there? And how do you think that's being used?
Well, so Revoice was surrounding this whole leftist play to do a Gramscian play about homosexuality, about sodomy, and to basically say that we need to be really tender towards men who are homosexual attracted. And we basically need to say that as long as they're not actually sodomizing one another or carrying out homosexual behaviors, sexual behaviors, then
the desire is okay.
Yeah, they could form like a covenant with another man and live with them and have a celibate
cuddle
friendship. They could have,
all of this happening within the PCA.
Yeah, it's happening in the PCA and the reform world, and the key point was that there was some of it was a debate about whether the desire itself, like if you're in that situation and you constantly desire to sodomize another man, Was that actually itself sinful if you resisted the desire and you didn't actually act on it? And we would obviously say, along with the Reformed tradition on concupiscence, that the desire itself is sinful and needs to be mortified. And so you absolutely can't be carving out this side B gay. I identify as gay, but I just don't sodomize another man. It's like identifying as a thief or a greedy man, and I just continue to use the label. But I don't actually go and do the thing. I just carve out this space where it's not sinful for me to want to. So the Revoice for Nazis tactic is to say that us and Joel Webbon are doing that same play with men who are sinfully partial against the Jews, or sin in, I guess, some ways that the Nazis did. So
it's usually like the hatred or the envy.
Yeah, they hate and they envy the Jews, but as long as they don't actually go and beat up Jews, nobody needs to address the state of the heart. That's fine. The behavior is really all that matters.
As long as they don't, and this was a real example, I think, in an OPC church where a young man went and like shot up a synagogue, and I think it's California. They're saying, the Revoice thing is saying, well, as long as you don't do that, it's fine.
Right. And
which, to be clear, I think it's very clear. Like,
it's bad.
This is kind of the point. That is not what we're saying. That's not a steel man of our position.
All sinful desire needs to be mortified. So those are the desires of the flesh, not of the new man. They need to be mortified, and see with any sin, how would you mortify that desire? You'll know that in glory, one of the ways to see that these sinful desires are sins in themselves is that in glory, we will no longer desire to commit sexual sin or greed or murder or whatever it may be. So some of the problems that surround this sort of language is that, again, it's not a steel man. Joel nor us, nobody would say that if somebody really wanted to, let's say, like deep in their heart, they absolutely wanted to commit genocide, we would just say, that's fine as long as you don't. I would say for any people group, if they were like, really, guys, I just have a problem with black people, and I want to murder them all. Like, I see a black person, little kid up to a grown man, and I just really want to kill them. And they'd come to us with that sort of thing, and I would say, okay, we have some work to do. We're going to establish it. We're going to start talking through the desires of the flesh, the murderous desires of your flesh that are rising up.
But I think it would be just to be clear, we would call that person to repent.
We would say you need to repent.
That's horrible.
Not only of like if you had done it, but you need to repent of the inward sinful desire.
You should not be cultivating that desire.
Absolutely not. Nobody should give quarter to that desire.
No.
But one of the things that's happening is that because of the looseness of the defining terms when it comes to anti-Semitism
and the assumption of envy.
Yeah, we're actually begging the question in many ways. We've smuggled into the premises the conclusion that a person is anti-Semitic by defining it very loosely in ways that before we even get to the conclusion, we've already rigged the game to say that somebody is sinning. I would even say that defining racism, again, these left-framed anti-Semitism as sinful partiality is fundamentally a tautologous definition, because partiality is not sinful in its absolute sense. Like, we can be partial in ways that are not sinful. I could prefer one thing over another. Being partial. I prefer kiwis to plantains. I am partial, but I'm not sinfully partial. I'm Italian, and maybe as I'm not Italian, but I don't know why I made myself Italian. Whatever. I'm me. And let's just say growing up, I, had a certain preference for my spouse. And in this case, you can see the preference by who I married. I was really into a light-skinned blonde woman, and I was attracted to her. And there were other things too, but the physical played in, and I had a preference. I was partial to that in a way that maybe I wouldn't have been attracted on the level of wanting to marry somebody even of a different racial characteristic. And it didn't mean that in my heart I had any kind of like sulfurous, I wanted to murder them, or I thought they were less than, or something. Like, I would do the thing that James is talking about when he talks about dealing with the poor and the rich in church, where, the rich man comes in and you say, here, take this good seat. Poor guy, you go sit over there in the corner. I wouldn't have had that sinful desire of the heart to treat another person that I didn't want to marry in that way. I just wouldn't have married them. So when we define racism or anti-Semitism or these things as sinful partiality, the problem is it's tautologous. It's like saying that it's sinful because it's sinful. We actually need to define what delineates ordinary partiality from sinful partiality. And so that actually doesn't move the debate forward. And this is where I think, just real quick, I know I'm monologuing.
Yeah, no, that's good.
But this is where I think the Revoice thing comes in. And some of the fine-tooth comb distinctions that need to be made to define these things or refute them is that, so if you say that the sinful partiality, like if you argue in that way, you're not being specific enough to refute the claim that the sinful motive, that we're not harboring these sinful motives or allowing them in a way where, like, let's say that somebody has a position about Jewish influence in politics or something like that, right? If we define that as sinful on its face, holding that belief, oh, you're being sinfully partial against the Jews for holding that belief. Well, now, of course, you're being revoiced for Nazis if, like Joel, you wouldn't discipline somebody merely for believing, whether they were right or wrong, or to the extent that Jews have a strong control of some aspect of government or culture or whatever. Because you've, on a definitional level, cooked the books, you've smuggled your conclusion into the premises, there's no fair debate possible. No one can ever excuse themselves until, to the poison glass thing, they flee to your exact position and framing.
Right. The other, the revoice word is problematic, but so is the term Nazi.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So this was actually something that, and people who've said, like, you guys are supporting Nazis because you like some Anon accounts or White Boy Summer or whatever. It's kind of the same deal where I've said to people, okay, define for me what is a Nazi? Define for me anti-Semitism. And I've usually gotten those tautologies in response where, well, we just all know it's sinful. Eric. Come on, you know what it is. And I said, no, let's define it carefully. I have never once gotten a clear, helpful, accurate definition.
People think you're
terms.
being pedantic.
Yes, but no, I'm actually trying to say, no, as Christians, we shouldn't be charging people with thought crimes or any crimes and charging them as sinful if we can't even define what the sin is.
It's like misogyny.
Yes.
When we're teaching on patriarchy or something, and I say, generally speaking, women should be workers at home. I don't want women out in our churches like teaching theology classes, or I want them doing
hate
Titus.
women.
So you're a misogynist.
Yes.
And then you say, well, what do you mean by a misogynist? And the person says, we know what it is. You're one of them. And you say, no, give me a definition. Okay, it's someone who hates and abuses women. So the problem is now they haven't done the work to demonstrate that your treatment of women is hateful or denigrating. They're assuming it in the premises.
Yes.
It's begging the question. Of course, you're going to conclude someone is a misogynist if you just get to own the dictionary, to Dan's point, about what defines a misogynist in the first place, instead of defining it in a way that can then, the actions and words and deeds can be actually examined under the light of reason.
Yeah, so it's an unfalsifiable claim. So you have two routes. You either say, you're right, I am a misogynist. Or you say, I'm not, and they say, a misogynist would say that. That's the Kafka trap.
The Kafka trap, yeah.
Well, and especially how you think of the term Nazi. Brian said in the cold open, nobody in our camp, nobody that we're affiliated with, talked to, including the Anons. There's tons of crazies out there. I'm not saying there's not. But the people that we actually know, nobody is saying, I am a Nazi, let's resurrect 1940s political party. Nobody. Doug said something in the Cross Politics show that I thought was interesting. He said, we never want to call somebody a Nazi who doesn't call themselves one. And he uses the Samuel Holden video because there was a 1936
The Olympics.
The Olympics. He said, Samuel is calling himself a Nazi. And I'm like, no. He's actually not. So
because you talked to him and he said, I'm not a Nazi.
Correct. And that's what I mean. Like, yeah. I specifically asked because I didn't recognize any of the images in the video. I said, hey, what's the deal with this? And I think the main point, from my understanding, was they were trying to offend the post-war consensus sensibilities.
They were committed on the level of when Doug said, if you really want to, make waves, make white babies.
Right.
A while ago. Doug knew what he was doing. Or when he said to the, the crazy Jezebel lady, I can't remember her name, and he used the C word. He said, they're saying of themselves, look, we're just a bunch of C words. And I don't have, I guess, the stones of Doug to say that word in public or in private, honestly, because it's a gross word. But what he was doing is he's intentionally outraging the God. What I called a Sunday school class once. This was an actual Sunday school class.
Was it the calling
things gay?
Yeah,
the virtue of calling things gay. Because what you're doing is you're looking the idol square in the eyes, and then you're poking it in both eyes.
Yes.
And when you poke something in both eyes, you know there's not going to be like your arguments were persuasive to me. They're going to be like outraged and hysterical. So there's a tactical thing there where I think you can judge the tactics. They're public actions. They're open for public debate. But you have to at least in charity say, in terms of the play, that's what you were doing when you did this thing.
Yes. The other thing that I think is helpful, we've had a lot of pastoral conversations with people, and a lot of really good people, I think, who feel caught in the middle. And so people who've come to church, people from afar, pastors. Again, Brian mentioned this in the cold open, but one of the questions that I get is, I wish you guys would just be clear about what you believe about Nazism, anti-Semitism, but particularly Stone Choir. And it's interesting because I've made numerous comments about it. Mm-hmm. Brian's made numerous comments about it. I know that it's like this, the gas clouding. You've been gas clouded. So a lot of times I haven't said anything because, number one, I've actually never listened to a Stone Choir podcast. So I'm like, well, I feel kind of stupid weighing in on a conversation that I'm not an expert in and have no experience with. How can I possibly denounce it? Now, I will say I've seen a lot of tweets from Corey and the other, is it Woe? The other host. I've seen the tweets. I think one this week was Hitler hating the Jews or attack, whatever he said, is proof that he was a Christian. And I read that and I thought, that is idiotic. I think that
some of the stuff like comparing mixed race children to feces. And I read that and I didn't like the reaction in my heart wasn't like, there's probably some nuanced debate here that could be had. I just went like, ugh.
Yeah.
Whatever we believe, not that.
Right. So to be clear, I think in our discussions with some of the pastors in Moscow, I was concerned because they're saying, hey, there's a huge problem. And I was like, okay, maybe there's something I'm missing. Because in our context, this isn't a problem. None of the people that I've talked to are, ready to become Nazis, or there's no hatred of the Jews. I'm just not seeing that. And we pastor a lot of people.
It's not hiding under like us not, guys, we have book groups constantly. We have leadership cohorts with, pretty much all of the men in our church who are, actively members and involved, parish events. We've talked about World War II, Nazism, anti-Semitism, the Jew stuff. We've talked about these things like in the way that, you get a bunch of nerds together who all play like the same video games or whatever. And they're like, oh, did you see the glitch at, if you up, down, left, right, X, Y jump, did you see that? And this, like our guys are tismed out on all sorts of, but you go through the stuff and you're like, what do you think about that tweet of Corey Mahler? Like, oh, that was dumb. That was stupid. Yeah. I don't know what he's doing with that. Like our guys aren't influenced in the sense of like, again, you said, I've never listened to even a minute of Stone Choir podcast. Not even 1 minute, not even 10 seconds. I've never hit play on a Stone Choir podcast. So it's not as if we haven't discussed some of these things with our guys, but we talked about it in the cold open. If we ask any of our guys, what do you think about this popular conversation that's happening, surrounding Stone Choir and these guys and our stuff and who Stephen Wolf and Doug Wilson, all this stuff. Most of them will say like 80 to 95% of them will say some variation of, I really disagreed with this. I agreed with this. I thought there needed more nuance here. Hated that. But, none of them are like, yes, ich bin ein Nazi.
I don't even know what that means.
I believe it means I am a Nazi.
Okay.
But
somebody's going to cut that. Yes.
You remember when what's his name said, I'm a jelly donut? Ich bin ein Berliner. I can't remember which president.
Yeah.
Maybe JFK.
So I think just providing clarity. And when a honest churchman asks me these questions, I will give an honest answer. What I am careful to do is not play the public denouncement game just for the sake of it, because I think it's a leftist play.
Do you know how? I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah,
I just interrupted Eric.
It's allowable.
Okay,
Dan is
I'm really tempted to interrupt you right now.
Here's
on
the thing,
performative denouncements and how they're never, you're never able to satisfy the appetite.
Okay, you will always be able to pull up another screenshot of another anonymous account or not anonymous account on X saying something, I'll just say stupid and sinful. And like, well, that was dumb. And I know what they're doing. They're being transgressive. They're being whatever. And you will never get to the bottom of denouncing them because they will keep making that. More new ones will keep happening.
Right.
So our approach to these things has generally been, it's not as if our positions are kind of mysterious. We are in the habit of recording multi-hour podcasts for years now, talking about stuff, including controversial stuff, where we just tell a hopefully well-researched historical tale, talk about the issues, apply them to our current day. That's our approach. The thing that the thing you're just not going to find, if you want it from us, I'm sorry, you're not going to find it, is constant discernment media, type of tactics, constant denouncements, and really allowing anybody to steer our denouncements through demands. It's just like not going to be a thing that we do. And the reason is because it's left coded. And if you do it, you've just adopted their frame. You've said you're right about you've paid the Dane Geld. You've said you're right about how this debate should go. You're in charge of it.
But I've seen other people do this where they're like, okay, fine, I'll denounce them. And then they denounce it, whatever the thing is. And then they're like, that wasn't enough.
It's never enough.
Denounce it again. Denounce it again. So one of the charge against our camp has been, why are you riling up the Anons? And why are you, and by which they mean, like, why is Eric, it was on the May blog this week, but, why is Eric sharing White Boy Summer meme, campy memes with 80s synth vibes? And, what I would say to that is, I think it's kind of cool.
Because we like them?
It's not, nobody in that movement is like, again.
I'm not asking boomers to understand millennial and zoomer humor.
No.
Like literally not going to do a course. It's okay if they don't. I don't lose any sleep if James White doesn't understand a meme I like.
That's right.
It doesn't bother me at all. I just don't think about it.
So I think about that whole conversation, and then I think about, A, the denouncements don't work. Number two, it's left coded. But then I also think this is a genuine strategic difference pastorally. That when I see young men particularly, and by the way, a lot of these Anons are guys with businesses and family men with more than 5 children and good churchmen and good churches. So, but let's talk about young men. If I see young men who are interested in this sort of subject matter, I say, well, we're Christians. Let's engage in debate and argumentation. As Brian mentioned earlier, let's present the cases. What I won't do is a left-coded denouncement, having never even listened to some of the content.
Wait, you're not allowed to even ask that question.
Right.
The J.D. Hall flat earth example was a great example.
Yeah, explain this, because I think J.D. had a great point.
And J.D. Hall is probably, whatever, there's like a whole, anytime on the internet now you mention a person, there's like a whole lore where the denouncement thing again, you're like, but did you know that J.D. Hall once sinned? You're like, okay, whatever. The whole thing was, it was a brilliant tweet. He basically said, this is how you should deal with subversive or conspiratorial or edge, like fringe conspiracy type of thinking, or anything that has the reputation of that. He's like, a guy, asked me, maybe it was in his church or something, asked, hey, what do you think about the earth? Like, do you think the earth is round? Do you think we've been to space? Do you think like the earth is flat? And J.D. Hall was like, no, but I've never heard, what do you think? And he said, and then he listened, and the guy for like 20 minutes explained why he believes the earth is flat. And as one of the hosts of Haunted Cosmos, let me just say that both Ben and I have been in these conversations multiple times. And instead of 20 minutes, it's been 2 hours and we've done the exact same thing J.D. Hall describes, which was he listened and then he gave like a couple, he was like, wow, that's really dumb. And the guy was like, well, am I in trouble? Could I be in your church and believe that? And he was like, yeah, what does that have to do with anything?
Right.
You can believe something dumb. Like you could believe that the Browns are the greatest NFL team of all time.
Right.
you would just be, I mean, you'd be wrong. Like the earth isn't flat. Like we've had these conversations.
I'm just impressed you used a sports analogy.
Everyone knows that I am like,
I know,
of the King's Hall, like very apt to reach for, it reminds me a lot of, that one quarterback that one time for the Dolphins.
Yes.
Who am I thinking of?
You're thinking of Tua Tagovailoa after the concussions.
Yeah, that's
after the.
I don't even need to say it because everyone knows.
Yeah. So providing clarity for the good people in the middle who are genuinely wondering, like, are you guys harboring Nazis? No. Are you Nazis? No. Are you anti-Semites? No. Are you avid fans of Stone Choir? We've not listened to it. And then saying, okay, for the good people, we're going to move on. One of the things I think that's interesting is with Buckley in his story, Jack Trotter brought this up, right? That he had outside influence upon him, ironically, by some Jewish people to get Joe Sobran fired. So it seems like, as wise Christians, one of the things we ought to do is also think through differing motivations. We should think through, okay, could there be political mechanisms at play? And this one I want to ask Dan. But Dan, you mentioned something that I thought was really interesting. James White, and we'll get into the timeline, by the way, in just a minute. But James White and Doug Wilson, at the end of July 22nd is the first Mablog, and then a dividing line shortly after, addressing the meme situation and anti-Semitism, and oh my gosh, there's a huge problem. And guess what? Doug just wrote a book. And, to his statement, I've defined envy, and then what do you know? I go looking for it, I find it. But think about the political situation that's going on in America in July. That's interesting. So I'm going to ask you about that in just a second. It's also interesting that this second wave of attacks publicly came, on the heels of the presidential election, November 2nd, right? And you would have to kind of at least wonder and say, are these politically motivated, these, publicizing of these events? So talk to me first about July.
No, those are really interesting questions. And maybe it's just giving someone too much credit. And it could just be that the timing was just happenstance. I don't really know. But what is interesting about the timing of this whole situation that we'll get into is that Joel Webbon was made aware of this meme that was sent from his church member back in February. Yeah. And so began working with this church member towards repentance, reconciliation. I'm sure he was examining, like, where is he? Standard counseling protocol, right? You ask a lot of questions, try to get down to the root of sin, get the facts. Yeah, make sure that you've got a right perspective before you start calling someone to repent or put them under church discipline and things like that. But then I don't know exactly when Doug Wilson and James White received the meme, but it was around July. I think it was July 22nd when Doug published his Mablog. And that just happened to be the day after it was announced that Joe Biden was stepping down from the presidential race.
It's a few short days after the assassination attempt.
Yes, that's right. And so politically, if you look at polling data, which I pulled up on Polymarket, you'll see that Trump had somewhere around like a 68% chance of winning. And that was, Kamala had some percentage points there and Joe Biden had some percentage points there. But it was just really interesting timing that right around the almost pinnacle of Trump's lead in the presidential polls, that was published. And then, like you said, after the election, Trump wins. And then the attacks resume. And
we know now, Doug has said publicly that one of his main concerns with this was whether or not Pete Hegseth, a CREC church member, would get confirmed as SecDef. Now, I don't know if he was thinking about it back then. We would have to ask. But
yeah,
certainly there's political thought going into it.
If it was politically motivated, the timing would seem to fit with that theory, simply because if you're trying to secure political power for yourself or for your friends or for someone, then you would actually have to distance yourself from these problematic elements. The fours, like we said in our cold open, the fours that are rabble rousers and speak most courageously to cultural issues, you'd have to distance yourself for the sake of political platforming. And so it does make sense as far as the timeline, but who knows? Doug would have to answer for that
and
himself.
that's why another point to clarify there. Yeah. This is why we're trying to be clear, direct, and offer a falsifiable claim that can be refuted.
Because at that point, it becomes really easy for Doug to say, actually, that was just happenstance. It was just timing, didn't think about it, wasn't a motivation. There's actually an easy out, which is important for a righteous man to be able to defend himself. But if it's an unfalsifiable charge, then there's no escaping it. So that's why, just to reiterate what you said, it's very important to be direct.
The one of the related, something that comes to mind is that you can think about it, the political dynamics. It's not wrong to seek power for you and your friends and try to leverage that power well. That's one of the things the right wing actually needs to recover. Yeah. So that's not our criticism. We should be seeking power and leveraging it for righteous ends in the political sphere, obviously. It's not obvious to everybody, but obviously that's one of the great needs. Think about somebody, though, running for like SBC president, maybe in 2018 or whenever. And that person, let's say that they liked Doug Wilson in the past and that Doug Wilson had talked positively about them before. Now that person's running for SBC president. That guy might have a political calculation where he goes, that's not going to help me. I need to denounce Doug Wilson because he's this radical, crazy guy who's like federal visionist and heretic, and he's, Steven Sittler and all this stuff, and he's got all this baggage. So the SBC guy who's previously friendly all of a sudden might go, start criticizing Doug. There's a similar temptation too, I think, for in Moscow. This might be a new sensation for them, honestly, because they've been forced like throughout for most of their lifespan. And but now there's like the embargo's lifted on Moscow, and they go, oh, we actually have mainstream, like Tucker has Doug on, amazing, and I'm for it. I want them to have mainstream influence, but there might be a calculation in there where they go, Ogden has said Joel Webbon said a lot of good things about us and like signaled our way, and like we shared their stuff maybe once or like there's been a signal, so I need to make sure that like we put some distance just to say, hey, other people watching, those guys, like they're crazy. We're not with them. And I'm not saying that's their words. I'm just saying, look at the pattern and just understand that this is a part of politics that the right actually needs to figure out. Is that there's a reason politics is, like you say, people are being political. It has a certain implication. It's because the art of politics really does include power calculus, and image, and image related to association. It's important we make it's not whether but which. You can't escape that. You're going to have those calculations. But we need to be careful that when they're doing them, we're doing them righteously and that we're being accurate.
And I would also say, like, what would actually be helpful? So we're sort of doing some postmortem on a lot of this stuff. Again, we'll get into the timeline in a minute. But part of it, if you want to build coalition within your camp and on the right, I absolutely think you should. We're not saying, seems to be a misunderstanding of Netter, where people think that we're saying, or it's been Doug is attributed to me or somebody else in our camp saying like, well, Eric apparently is fine with all these really, really actually sinful things happening on the right. I'm not fine with them. That is completely not what I'm saying. But I am saying in a 1 Corinthians chapter 6 type way, we ought to prove the viability of our internal polity by proving that we can deal with these things internally in a way that doesn't destroy us in front of the left.
Yeah, two things. One, I'm not going to give oxygen with 60,000 Twitter followers to every passing Anon who says something edgy. That's what he wants me to do.
Yes.
That's what the Anon wants me to do. Two, when I have relationship with somebody who says something I think is off, first thing I'm going to try to do is actually talk to them and say, tell me why you said that. What do you think? Yes. Am I wrong or are you wrong?
And this is my point. I think one of the things that would have been good for coalition building is, let's say last spring, Moscow, Doug, they're thinking through all these things. They're thinking about the political situation, which they should. That's good. You should think through the political situation. But if you notice, like, oh, man, I think we have a problem in our camp, it would probably be wise to sit the major players down and say, hey, I'm kind of seeing this thing. I think it's a problem in the camp. How do you guys think we should collaboratively go about dealing with this? And at those points, you can even have strategic differences. Mm-hmm. But if I understand their tactic, they understand mine, and we agree not to destroy each other in the process or destroy our friends, then I think that's a fine conversation and a wise conversation to have.
I mean, the problem is, strategically speaking, though, that doesn't seem to be the motivation.
No.
And one thing that Doug has said over and over again, we've seen this a lot the last 4 or 5 years, his phrase, "Don't take the bait." Mm-hmm. He's said that a lot. But the issue that we were presented with, the strategy that was deployed, was actually, it was the gas cloud fallacy, it was the Kafka trap or whatever. And it actually took something that was probably a minuscule issue within our camp, and it inflamed it by just attacking men's character with this unfalsifiable charges. And so, especially younger men who had looked to Doug as somewhat of a father figure in the faith, as a man who's courageously leading in the front, who's fighting the cultural battles, who's actually doing the fatherly work of saying, "Son, let me tell you," even if it's through books or blogs or his Twitter, "let me tell you how to order your home. This is what a good father should do. This is how you should discipline your kids. This is how you should relate to your wife. This is how you should relate to the church." So men that look to him as somewhat of a father figure, all of a sudden has turned on them and has given this inescapable charge of sin that actually damages their reputations, to the point where he's saying, or others in his camp are saying, that you actually shouldn't be a pastor. You should be put under church discipline as a member of a church if you believe this thing that's not exactly in line with what I believe. And so that caused a very small, minuscule issue to actually become inflamed, to where you see a lot of young men who are very zealous, and they fall into this trap quite frequently, where it's like, as soon as you tell a boy or a young man, don't do this thing, you're going to be tempted to do it. Don't do it. The first human instinct is to want to do the thing, right? But then you do it in a way where there's no escape. Like you're going to be guilty of the sin, whether you committed it or not, in that person's mind, by the way that they frame the argument.
It
and
could
there's
be
no
that you're
escaping.
actually creating Absaloms.
That's right. And so instead, we have this poison gas cloud fallacy, and the bait is laid out there. And a lot of men have taken the bait, right? To where before they were like, "Oh, that's funny. I never really thought about the Jews." But now that you brought it up and you've made me into this category of I'm a sinful anti-Semite, then I am actually going to own it. We've seen this on the right many, many times, especially from younger men. That's actually a part of the reason why Trump won, is because finally guys were like, "You know what? Yeah, I'm white. I do have privilege." What's that?
I am a deplorable.
Yeah, that's right. And they end up owning it. And so it brings confirmation to the charges because men took the bait. And it actually destroys entire communities.
I wanted to say one more thing about anons. And that is that crowds are, and not whether but which, to just rip off Doug. It's an inescapable concept of leadership, that crowds are not, you're going to have crowds no matter what. And I want to point out that one of the criticisms has been, well, guys, you say that you don't agree with some of these anon tweets or this one or that one, and if we give you an example of a really egregious one, you guys would also be like, "Hey, I don't like that." But they all seem to love you guys, and they seem to consider you like, "I like Ogden, not those guys." So they seem to be your guys. And I would just say, okay, let's back up a couple years. When Doug in Moscow was going hard against the gospel coalition culture and against Big Eva correctly and leveling a lot of these charges, that's when a lot of us were won. There were absolute rabbles and crowds following them everywhere they went, ratioing everything that any of these Big Eva guys would do that would criticize Doug. Most of those guys were running these plays on Doug. They were like being imprecise. They were gas clouding him. They were being very political. And there'd be rabbles of, like, we have successfully ratioed the Gospel Coalition into irrelevance. Their Twitter account is defunct. It has like 300,000 followers and the engagement of a person with 20. Okay. They are nothing. They are gone. And the rabbles were a huge part of that. The meme lords, the edgy anons, they would go out and fight. They would tilt at every single TGC guy and fill in the blank with any of Doug's controversies. The race one concerning blacks and slavery and Southern slavery, any of these things. There's been an army, and I just suspect that if you went back in history and you analyzed all of their communication channels from social media to blogs to et cetera, you wouldn't find Moscow spending an enormous amount of their time counter-signaling or policing that crowd because they were generally speaking, like there were bad actors in there, probably said sinful things about Kevin DeYoung or someone else. And, but it didn't, I'm saying Doug didn't need to do that. I'm not faulting him for that. He was right not to.
But why do we have to do it now?
You actually don't. Like, it's enough to state your positive case. People should be charitable and not assuming that the behavior of the worst people who happen to like you for one reason or the other, that characterizes or you must approve of it. That's, again, fallacious reasoning.
It's interesting because this was part of the conversation I had with James White, ongoing. But he was like, you need to do more to denounce the anons. And I'm like, well, first of all, I'm not going to denounce an anonymity in and of itself. Because, I mean, even, founding fathers, they wrote anonymously. There's often a point to that, to be able to speak truth and not have your livelihood or your family destroyed. They were courageous men, guys like Ben Franklin. They were courageous to a large extent. So I'm not going to do that. But it was interesting because in one of our exchanges, a very prominent anon posted in response to me siding with James. And he was like, yeah, I totally agree with you. Eric and Brian and the guys in Ogden, they don't preach the gospel. They don't love Christ.
This is a great case in point.
He goes off. And so I texted James. I just screenshot it and I texted him. And I said, okay, if I have to denounce the people in my feed whom I don't agree with, who are, making really rude comments or whatever it is, or just false comments, I feel like you should have to, say something to this guy. And he responded to me. He said, well, how can I be held responsible for this guy? I mean, I didn't say it. And I thought, okay, this seems to be like complete hypocrisy. Now, what I would also say is this. One of the things that has been a common question is, why don't you just submit to these older guys? They're clearly the more mature party, blah, blah, blah. And what I've said throughout to both camps, you'll remember I had posted on the Westminster Confession of Faith, superiors and inferiors. Each of us have duties in this thing. If you're the old men and you want to claim the mantle as the mature, older, wise men, you should probably act like older, wiser, mature men. And in many cases, I have not seen that to be the case. People have said, well, why don't you just communicate with them? We are communicating with them. We're communicating with them repeatedly through text, through phone calls, through letters to elder boards, and all sorts of other things. To Brian's point in the cold open, that's gone almost nowhere to this point.
And it's ongoing. And so again, people ask, why are you releasing this episode? Why are you doing
Correct.
This? Well, partly because if you wait until the process of communication between parties privately ends, you never say anything publicly because those things can never, like, there is a sense in which they can just keep going forever. Well, at some point you have to come out and just say, these are some public things that are said. These are specific things we have an issue with. Here's our actual position. Just clear your name. And even if you're leveling charges, accusations, whatever, they're falsifiable, like we've said.
That's right. And I would also say to people, maybe just be wary of the double standard. So people are sort of like, every time I make a public comment that's even mildly related to this situation, people are like, oh, wow, so immature. You should have gone direct. And I'm like, hold on. In the last 2 weeks, there's been 3 Mayblogs written specifically about me that are very straw man-y type Mayblogs. Doug is clearly fine going public about these issues. He did not contact me about any of those. He didn't reach out via text and say, hey, let me set up a call with Eric. Maybe we can clear something up. And we're in the midst of communication process, and he's still going public. So at some point, I feel like it's fine to say, well, yes, Matthew 18 is really important. We are doing those things. However, when there's public comment on public record, why would you require that one person can keep speaking publicly, but the other has to be quiet?
And to be clear, I'll look at the camera. To be clear, anything that I say publicly, feel free to address publicly. A sermon, a tweet, a podcast, because that's the rules. That's the nature of public speech. Criticize Eric, criticize me, criticize Jan, criticize any of us on our public speech. We're not going to, and we don't do this. We don't say like, why didn't you email me first? Because I said it publicly, right? It's like a politician giving a stump speech and then expecting his opponents to like send him a letter before they post on Twitter. I'm not voting for that guy and here's why. Like, it's public. This is public discourse.
Yes.
So there is a point. Some of our friends were worried, like, you guys, you didn't release this episode earlier, the first version of this episode. because of private talks with Moscow and all this kind of stuff. Like, I'm worried that you're never going to release anything, and if you believe this false standard, that you can't ever say anything publicly till it's all resolved to the bottom privately.
We don't believe that.
We're trying to make distinctions between what we would and wouldn't address publicly versus privately. That's true. But something like this, I think, is necessary. Just, again, even just for the fact that even if Pastor Wilson or none of these men intended to call us anti-Semites, and they might say that, the reality is we have dozens and dozens and dozens of calls, both in our community and out, saying, guys, Doug Wilson thinks you're racist anti-Semites. Are you really?
Yeah, and I would point out
that's the conclusion they're reaching.
Some of those calls and points of contact have come from churchmen in Moscow. Like, hey, it seems like, it feels like, that's the impression being given. And so, yeah, it's not to run anybody's name through the mud, but it is to say public statements have been made. People are having certain assumptions. We can respond fairly, directly, and then they're free to re-engage as well. Gentlemen, one of the things I want to do is jump into the timeline, and then we'll have a few more discussion points after that.
As we jump now into the timeline of events, it is our goal to clear up any misunderstandings or misrepresentations that have been floating around X and in various response videos online. We also find that it is helpful to paint an accurate picture of what actually happened before arriving at any conclusions. We have made many calls with many of the parties involved to verify claims, timeline of events, and each party's involvement. We've also listened to the relevant podcasts and read the relevant blogs in order to seek greater clarity surrounding the situation. As many of you know, we've addressed our concerns with Doug Wilson, the elders at Christ Church, James White, Tobias, and Joel. Some of these conversations remain ongoing. Let's begin with the key players involved in the recent online drama. First, Tobias Riemenschneider is a pastor in Germany. One of his church members moved to Georgetown, Texas, where he became a member at Joel Webbon's church. Joel is the lead pastor at his church and runs Right Response Ministries, a large Reformed online media platform. Doug Wilson is a pastor at Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, writes the blog and Mablog, and publishes books, videos, and other media through Canon Press. Dr. Joe Boot oversees the Ezra Institute. Dr. James White runs Alpha and Omega Ministries and is an elder at Apologia Church in Arizona. We'll begin in the spring of 2024. Consider this pertinent background information. Joel Webbon invited Doug Wilson, as well as our crew from Ogden, to speak at the Right Response Conference in early March. While at the conference, Doug privately addressed some of us about his need to make a public statement calling for a ceasefire between us and Allie Beth Stuckey regarding an online back and forth we had been having on X. Doug released such a statement during the conference, taking Eric. The reason he gave privately for his need to make such a statement was that he had done an interview with The Blaze, and they had threatened to round file the interview if he didn't say something publicly. Doug also spoke with Joel about an upcoming podcast series Joel was planning with Andrew Isker about Zionism and dispensationalism. In that conversation, Doug told Joel that if he did the series with Isker, the doors of Moscow would be closed to him. Joel moved forward with that project and posted it to his Patreon channel. In February, before the conference, the church member from Joel's church had been texting with his former pastor Tobias from Germany. One of the things he'd sent was a text message with a meme that featured a Holocaust-related joke. Tobias reached out to Joel and at some point sent the meme to James White and Doug Wilson. On July 22nd, Doug Wilson mentioned this in his blog, titled A Rejoinder to the Internet Randos on the Jews, NatCon 4, and a Couple of Hindus. In the blog post, Doug posted the meme and described an incident in which, quote, a parishioner periodically gets drunk and starts spewing hatred towards the Jews, end quote. He also said, quote, I have a pastor friend who had a parishioner move away who then came under some bad influences and started sending around memes like, Mom, what's the Holocaust? It was the one time Jews had to do manual labor, so they claimed it killed them. That's the kind of thing that requires cold law and hot gospel. You can't fix it with sunglasses and a joke about white boy summer. The task is to keep these people from going to hell, end quote. As an important point of clarification, Pastor Webbon has confirmed that the church member was not getting drunk while sending text messages to Tobias. Doug also said that what drives this sort of thing is envy. He went on to say, on the basis of Paul's argument about the Jew-Gentile relations, quote, "I look for envy, and sure enough, I see it," end quote. Though he didn't mention Joel in the post by name, several people began asking Joel if this was about his church, given he'd been a speaker at the New Christendom Press Conference. At the time, Christchurch deacon and cross-politic host Gabe Wrench had been attacking White Boy Summer on X, and so naturally, people were starting to connect the dots. On July 31st, James White went on The Dividing Line to talk about the same meme and a concern with the alleged anti-Semitism it represented. And in that episode, he threatened to start naming names. He also called for church discipline for both the church member and the pastor, whom he said should not be a pastor. James later told Joel that he did not know who the situation was about when he threatened to name names. On August 7th, a Zoom call took place between Tobias, Joel, the church member, and other parties. Unbeknownst to Joel or Tobias, the church member had recorded the call on a separate device. In the call, Tobias made repeated calls for excommunication and/or church discipline. He also said that there was a contingent of pastors forming an alliance against Joel, Brian, Eric, Andrew Isker, and Stephen Wolfe, and that contingent was made up of James White, Doug Wilson, Joe Boot, and others. The church member from Joel's church repented for any offense he had given, as well as previous things he had said about the Jews and the Holocaust. The call ended with Tobias stating that no further action was needed, and that he would talk with Joel and the church member if any further steps were to be taken by him. But on September 13th, Tobias appeared on the Chris Arnzen show, Iron Sharpens Iron. In that episode, Tobias specifically named Joel, Brian Sauvé, and Eric Kahn as pastors leading a racist and anti-Semitic movement in America. He elaborated that Eric had retweeted a quote about Aristotle, which said that multiculturalism was detrimental to a healthy democracy. Tobias said that Eric was supporting, quote, race segregation by retweeting the Aristotle reference. On October 2nd, Joel recorded and released a podcast about the situation. He did so because he was told by Eschatology Matters that they were releasing a podcast with Tobias in which he would be giving his narrative of the situation. Joel's intent was to get ahead of the narrative, which is why he recorded and released the episode. He wanted to reiterate that the church member had repented for past comments, was in good standing with the church, and that Tobias's calls for excommunication and/or church discipline were unwarranted. On October 29th, Eschatology Matters posted a video response from Tobias about the whole situation. In the episode, Tobias claimed that he never called for church discipline or excommunication when talking to Joel. It's also important to note that before publishing this video, and according to multiple sources close to the situation, Doug Wilson and James White had consulted on a Zoom call with Tobias about what he would be saying in his video recording. When this episode came out, Joe Boot, James White, and Doug Wilson helped promote it on X. The same day, October 29th, Chris Arnzen sent an email to a redacted recipient. And in that email, Chris shared the recent podcast episode from Eschatology Matters with Tobias and said that he had been in contact with James White and Doug Wilson prior to the date of the email. He wrote, quote, "I've been involved in a group discussion with fine men of God like Doug Wilson, James White, and others who all agree that this assessment of Joel Webbon is completely accurate," end quote. The assessment, Arnzen went on to say, was that, quote, "Joel Webbon has clearly adopted sinful anti-Semitic views that at best trivialize the Holocaust and at worst deny it completely and contain revisionist understanding of the depth of sin which Hitler and the Nazis were guilty," end quote. The next day, on October 30th, Joel sent the Zoom call recording to Eschatology Matters, who promptly removed Tobias's video. On November 1st, Eschatology Matters issued a full retraction of the video. The statement reads as follows, quote, Finding yourself caught in a conflict between two parties who have both benefited you is terrible. And that's the situation we created when we released a video regarding Tobias Riemenschneider and Joel Webbon. We regret this deeply. Our regret isn't only due to the conflict it's brought to the body of Christ, but also because we didn't have all of the facts. There may still be more information needed to resolve it fully. We recognize that our actions led to the unnecessary slander and speculation against a fellow Christian pastor, Joel Webbon, and Covenant Bible Church. We repent and ask for forgiveness. The issue and facts in this situation are complex and private in nature. We hope for peace and resolution between the parties involved. For our part, we've decided to step back from this conversation, praying that everyone involved can continue to bless the body of Christ, end quote. They also went on to say, quote, "Nothing in our video that we pulled down should be used in any way against Joel. It is filled with mischaracterizations and falsehoods. If there is any evidence to the contrary of this statement, it is on Tobias himself to provide it. We fully retract the video as unreliable and false," end quote. We also spoke with a source close to the situation who said it appeared there was a concerted effort by a coalition of men, including Wilson and White, to destroy Joel. Later, Tobias would respond again and state that the team at Eschatology Matters was divided on the decision. However, this is not the case. One contributor, not a controlling partner, disagreed with the decision, but the two men in charge at Eschatology Matters were unanimous in their agreement that Tobias's video included falsifications and misrepresentations. They released another statement later which said as much. On November 25th, Doug Wilson went on the Cross Politics show to give his version of the timeline about the conflict between Joel and Tobias. In the show, Wilson said that Joel had recorded the phone call without Tobias's knowledge in an attempt to set him up. Doug said it was unfair that Joel knew the call was being recorded, but Tobias didn't. However, as we have already shown, Joel did not know the call was being recorded until after it had taken place. The only person who knew it was being recorded was the church member. On that show, Doug also claimed that Joel was doing the, quote, Revoice for Nazis, end quote, thing by supposedly going soft in the sin of antisemitism. Doug went on to say that Joel unfairly withheld the Zoom call from Tobias. He made it sound as though Tobias hadn't received the call for a lengthy period of time. But after Joel shared the call with Eschatology Matters and a few other contacts to get counsel, it was leaked via Eli McGowan from a group chat to Tobias, who had the full video only a few days after Tobias's video on Eschatology Matters was pulled on October 30th. The reason Joel didn't want to share the video with Tobias was because the church member was then in the middle of an immigration process, and he didn't want that process to be disrupted by publicizing his name. Further, Doug said on Cross Politic that Joel was the one to take the matter public, but as our timeline has shown, this is false. In July, Doug and James White had addressed it publicly without naming Joel, but strongly alluding to his church, and then Tobias explicitly named Joel on September 13th on the Chris Arnzen show. James White had also threatened to name names in the July airing of The Dividing Line, which would indicate that he did in fact know who it was about, namely Joel Webbon. On November 28th, Tobias responded again via YouTube. In his response, he repeated arguments that Doug had made, including the fact that the Zoom call was a setup and had wrongfully been withheld from him. He did not back down from his earlier comments made on the Chris Arnzen show about Joel. He criticized Eschatology Matters for their statement and said they had no right to make such a pronouncement about the veracity of his previous claims. He said the team at Eschatology Matters was divided in the decision, which Eschatology Matters has strongly refuted. After reviewing the timeline, some serious questions arise. Why was a private matter between pastor and congregant paraded before the eyes of the public in the first place? Why wasn't this handled privately? Why were Doug Wilson and James White coordinating behind the scenes with Tobias throughout this process? And why didn't their involvement end by encouraging Tobias and Joel to seek personal, private reconciliation? If Doug and James were not a part of a concerted effort to publicly attack Joel or form a coalition against him, why haven't they come out to dispute Tobias's claims that such a coalition was being formed? If the heart of the matter is a difference in opinion on pastoral strategy, why wasn't that handled among gentlemen privately?
All right, gentlemen. So we've gone over the timeline. And really, Brian, we have two more questions that we want to answer. But I think, Dan, you asked some really important questions. First of all, at the end of the timeline. And I think probably at the heart of it is, why was this ever made public? Do you think that's a fair assessment to ask that question of this situation?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about the number of situations we've encountered in our church that have been resolved privately, because this is just the right order of operations, if you will. There's just boiling it down, it's just its most basic level. You have a man in a church who shared a meme that somebody was offended by. And maybe there were other texts in there that gave this pastor concerns, his former pastor. And so the former pastor contacts his current pastor, where he's in membership at a church, and says, I received this from a member in your church, and I think is worth bearing address. And so I'm willing to help walk through this process, but you're the authority. So I will just submit to your authority and will just aid in whatever way I can. That should be the end of it, as far as the circle of knowledge. Because part of church discipline, by the way, is that the escalation, you see this in Matthew 18, is that you begin to involve more parties, right? So if your brother sins against you, go to him. If he repents, you've gained your brother. If he doesn't, take witnesses, 2 or 3. And so you see it expands all the way to the church. But what we have in this situation, as it appears, is that you have the one-on-one with Tobias going to Joel and to this church member, and then getting repentance. But for some reason that wasn't satisfactory, and they're just going to use him to essentially show this underlying issue of this horrible envy that's underlining the entire reformed world, and just use this poor church member as a spectacle. I mean, it's hard to actually imagine anybody that's been sinned against more than this church member, who actually, by Joel's own mouth, saying that he's actually repented of whatever sins he committed.
Well, it's interesting too, because Brian, one of the things that this whole situation has brought up is, number one, I think the danger of big platforms and a media platform. Obviously, if none of the parties involved had media platforms, we probably wouldn't know about this, and that's probably where it should stay. So one of the dangers could be that whether this was the motivation or not, it was certainly a prominent theme in No Quarter November. There were bridges burning. They were about all these topics. There's a public statement. At the end of No Quarter November, Doug ran a post on the Mablog, and he was like, yeah, it's been a great month. We've had lots of traffic. I'm thinking about that more pastorally, probably, because to that point, we hadn't even addressed it publicly or anything like that. Weren't actually interested in doing so until, as Brian's mentioned, we kind of had to. But Brian, it seems like that could be a real danger, is that you get in this cycle of clicks and likes and engagement, mm-hmm. and then you start publicizing things that really ought not to be publicized.
Yeah, this is a huge danger. And honestly, like let's just call it what's happening is that there were people that wanted to criticize Joel, and they leveraged a situation they ought not to have leveraged to make that critique, rather than just critiquing Joel.
Right.
So our friend Joel says a lot of stuff. Like, he says stuff professionally. That's what, like, and he says stuff all day, every day online. He does multiple videos a week. So there's no shortage of things where you could just take Joel's words, and if you wanted to make a critique of them, you could steel man him and say, this is what Joel said. I'd like to critique Joel Webbon for Joel Webbon's views on this view that Joel Webbon holds.
Even if it's a form of engagement.
It'd be totally fine.
Yeah.
Joel, and to the thing we already said, public speech is open to public repudiation, refutation, argumentation, whatever. So that would have been totally fine. We wouldn't be making this episode. Like I've said before, I don't agree with everything I've said, let alone Joel or you, or like we all.
Whoa. I got
Eric's the exception.
Okay.
The thing about saying things publicly is, and especially when you say a lot of things, is that you are going to miss some of the time. And then some things are going to be disputable, where good faith people in good faith can disagree and still say we've had the dialogue and we still disagree. Mm-hmm. And then, so there's that whole gamut. My read, like my back of the cereal box read, or like my napkin math read of this situation, is people wanted to attack Joel, and maybe us too, based on some of the stuff that Dan went through in the timeline. And instead of doing that, they just doing that directly, they made kind of a case in point that ended up, like, in their defense, it ended up being super unwise. I don't think it was well thought through. And I think they picked a bad guy to try to do it through, like this sort of proxy through Tobias. I think that was a mistake. And I think that should just be owned by the parties involved. Like, I would just like, we said we'd ask at the very end of the episode, like, what do we want to see happen? I would love to see guys just say, that was a miss. We wanted to critique Joel. We think he's been flirting with Nazi stuff. And so here's our argument.
Yeah, and maybe, we should have gone to him directly. Even if we addressed it publicly, we should have just said, hey, we're critiquing Joel. Yeah,
we're critiquing Joel and Joel's views and Joel's... but the specific situation was so mishandled. It's like a Pastoral 101 type of stuff that when a guy is allegedly sins and you bring him, and like Tobias going to Joel and saying, I have a problem with your church member, you're the relevant authority. That's great. Let's talk about this. And then when it was handled and the person repented of whatever sin, and whatever sin they said they had in their heart or something, that should have been the end of it. This is Pastoral Ministry 101. Absolutely in no case should the subsequent stuff have been said publicly.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that you can't make a critique of Joel or us or whomever. Seriously, like if you go on a show and you say Brian, as whatever his name is, did, and said Brian and Eric are leading an anti-Semitic and racist movement in America. Okay, cool. Go say that. I would love to see the receipts for why they think that's true so that we can refute them. But don't like drag in a random guy from Joel's church.
Right.
That's pretty pastorally negligent.
Yeah, it seems like too, one of the things that was the reason why this was delayed, why we didn't just jump in right away, was because I wanted to do what I felt like hadn't been done, which was kind of to put some old journalistic skills to the test and also pastoral skills of like, well, let's just call everybody. Let's talk to all the involved parties. Let's see if we can't get the story straight. So the narrative and the timeline is really what everybody affirmed. So everything, again, journalistic fashion, you got to have two sources. You got to make sure that stuff is verified. So we did that. And one of the things I think, Dan, to me, that came out of the timeline was this looks like it was a concerted effort, meaning Doug and James White were involved from the beginning. And at multiple points along the way, the two Zoom calls before Tobias's recordings, I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know their precise motives, but I'm sitting there thinking, well, why wasn't there counsel at that point? Like, no, you're not going public. You're going to go back to Joel. We're going to handle this privately. We don't need to drag a churchman through this. Do you agree that it looks that way?
Well, yeah, if you're just looking at the timeline itself, it looks very suspicious. But then you also have confirmation from Tobias, who said in the Zoom call that there's a coalition of pastors that included James White, Doug Wilson, Jeff Durbin, Joe Boot, and others that are being formed being formed against us. And
go ahead.
I can't remember the exact quote, so I'm just going to stop there. But there was a coalition, and they are opposed to Ogden, well, specifically Eric and Brian. So thankfully, I'm in the clear.
Dan's clean. Dan is.
But I think the other comment that was made by Tobias was, Joel, you had the option to choose better men, and instead you chose.
That's right. You could have
losers in Ogden.
Yeah, that's right.
And look, I mean, sympathetic.
Yep.
Look at us.
You could have partnered with Doug Wilson and with James White, but instead you chose Isker and Wolf and the Ogden guys.
So this seems like another potential danger, though, Brian, is like turf warfare.
Yeah.
In all this, we have been really clear, I think, in our intention with a lot of this. As you said, we've promoted Moscow. We've promoted a lot of other material from across the spectrum.
Lots of people, yeah.
We have actively tried to fight this instinct to be ruthlessly territorial, and instead to say, hey, it's a big pie. Christendom wins when we have multiple platforms and multiple voices doing, let's be honest, very different work. Like,
it's not a zero-sum game. Yeah.
James White is doing apologist stuff with Muslims. That's very different than what we're engaged in. Doug has his sphere. Joel has his. We tend to look at it as, I'm not in competition with Canon Press.
Absolutely not. No.
We want to support them. We've enjoyed a lot of the stuff that they put out. But what could be the danger of seeing it as just a ruthless game of territorialism.
We need to not give in to now I want to circle back to something in a minute, but we need to not give into the territorialism, the zero-sum game, the fixed pie of glory, as we've put it before.
Yeah.
Like that if right response gets a lot of YouTube people and whatever, then that means someone else can't succeed too. Like I actually want all of the churches involved to flourish. I want lots of different publishing houses to arise. Guys that came to our conference even, recently, and they were like, hey, we're doing a publishing house. Like a lot of what we're doing is basically, we just looked at what you guys did and we're doing all that same stuff.
And we were actually happy to share a lot of
like, great
trade secrets. Like, here's how we've done it. We want you to be successful.
Yeah, great. Here's some tips. We've promoted everything from Ezra Institute to Canon and all these things. And where I see people doing good work, my inclination is to go, great job, keep it up, love it. One thing I did want to circle back to.
Yeah.
Is I want to head off because we're not saying, but Tobias claimed that there was this sort of conspiratorial, or just coalition of men behind the scenes who were saying we need to address some of these things, and with Ogden and these guys. Okay, what we're not saying is like with group chats, GCs for me, but not for thee.
Yeah.
All of us are in group chats with guys where we talk about stuff happening in the Reformed world, or like, what do you think about this thing James White said, or what do you think about this thing Cannon did, or I just saw your episode, guys. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about John Harris, or like, we're all in group chats with a lot of different men from across the Reformed world. Yeah, one of the main group chats I'm in has got Baptists, Presbyterians. It's got all sorts of guys, and we talk about stuff all the time. And if you were in it, you could tell based on like posting in social media that we're all talking about something, and then all of us are posting our various thoughts on something. Sometimes you can even coordinate things in a group chat where you say, we have this concern, how do we address it? All of that is licit. Feel totally free to do that. I'm not saying that Pastor Wilson and James White and Tobias Riemenschneider and whom these guys can't have a group chat where they say, hey, do you think this issue is an issue too? How should we address it? The problem I have is just coming back and saying, someone in that chat should have said, whoa, not this. If we disagree with Joel, let's just go disagree with Joel. Great. Do you guys have any evidence of like, yeah, here's a link to where Joel said this, or where Brian and Eric said this. Here's a tweet. Let's analyze it. I'm going to do a podcast about it. You write about it. I actually don't care if people do that.
No.
GCs for me and not for thee? No, that's not what we're saying. Every GCs for all of the these. You can all have GCs. Have fun. Talk, be friends, shape culture, form coalitions. Totally great. I just want to make sure we're arguing Christianly.
Yeah, I think that's really good. One of the other things that we promised we would answer, and it's related, I think, to the timeline, is the question of why we're not going to sign the Antioch Declaration. A lot of the people, collaborators, and then people around it have said things like, well, all this drama has nothing to do with the Antioch Declaration. So we'll start with Dan. Do you think that's true? And how did it frame kind of how we're thinking about the document?
I think that the timeline and the Antioch Declaration are tangled together. This is why we said in the cold open that we were not going to sign the Antioch Declaration. One of the points was that because you can't untangle it from the timeline, because the contributors are the same, just maybe by chance, as the people who are in this supposed faction or group that's coming against us. And it's not a consensus document like they claim. And so it's really hard to untangle it from the timeline. And so even some of the pressure that was received privately to sign it maybe was genuine from motives that were completely righteous. But within the timeline of events and with everything that's going around, with the information that we've received, even that still feels like a coercion to actually participate in this, to just capitulate on our principles, quite honestly.
Yeah, I refuse to treat Tobias as an authoritative voice as a result of all of this on a collaborator in a document that I would support, just on that level. On the content level, I thought the document, the statement was convoluted and unclear and included many non sequitur type of issues. Aristotle was a good example of that, the Aristotle stuff or whatever it was. I read through it and I thought for a document that's aiming for clarity, it really needed to be written in a more journalistic or a theological style instead of like a drunk Chesterton. And then lastly, sorry, I didn't mean that to be like, that's genuinely what it came across. It was like, did a drunk Chesterton write significant portions of this? Because that's kind of like, it's trying to be quippy. It's like, it's not where you go quippy, you know?
Well, I think, and to your point, I think in documents like this, you want more of that old Westminsterian, like almost dry systematic theology that's really crystal clear and, footnoted, and like it's a space for systematized thought, not for
right. And one of the criticisms that was responded to is like, oh, it's really hard to understand. And so one of the contributors said, well, just because you don't have a good grasp of the English language doesn't mean that it's hard to understand. It's like, no, actually it's not the words that I have a hard time with. It's the way that they're arranged that makes things unclear.
Yeah. You need more Stephen Wolfian, the way he writes in Case for Classical
systematic.
Christian. It's systematic. And the last problem I have, we talked about it, but just to make it very clear, is that for a document like this that's aiming to bring people together, lest it be a poison gas clouding of everybody else and saying, flee to my exact position or you're an anti-Semite, it ought to have been a document that was collaborated on by multiple different views.
Because the whole point of a consensus document is to bring people together, usually from disparate camps.
Well, and even Doug said on that cross-politic episode at the end of November was that it wasn't necessarily, well, this is reading between the lines. He didn't say this. If it was a consensus document, then this wouldn't be true, what he said, which is this document was really like a line in the sand to figure out where people aligned.
Totally.
So it's not a consensus document.
And if you want a line, like again, the clarity thing, if you want a line in the sand, then it needs to be a line and not a series of squiggles. So that's a lot of the issue. There was another one later that was like the natural affection statement that was more clear. But at that point, it was like, look, we're just not going to play the whole statement game. Just going to keep being positive about what we believe, engage with these issues. And also, there doesn't need to be a rush to like figure out every single thing to where everybody agrees all the time right away when there's dispute. People can have different emphases. One of the things that Stephen Wolf said on the panel at our conference that was really, I thought, compelling and insightful, he was talking about the criticism that like some guys just seem obsessed with the Jews. They seem obsessed with whatever. And he basically just said, look, people are allowed to be interested in things.
Stop Jesus juking.
Yeah, like people could be interested in golf and talk a lot about that, or they could be interested in like Pol Pot and talk a lot about that, or they could be interested in some whatever. That's fine. It doesn't mean they're idolaters about that thing. That's a TGC coded argument, right? Like if you love your wife and you think a lot about your kids and you're an idolater. And it's like, the whole thing came across to me as a strong arm political play to attempt to force consensus, draw a line in the sand. That's fine. If you want to draw a line and say, this is what I believe, and I don't want anybody on my team who is not within this circle I've just drawn. But again, draw a circle, not a series of squiggles.
Yeah, it does seem like it was really trying to solidify the tribe. Who's on my team, who's not on my team in this zero-sum game. That's just the appearance. Maybe it could be wrong. Mm-hmm. But if that's the case, one of the dangers of a zero-sum game philosophy as you enter into especially the Christian world, is that when you fight then, it's not actually to come to truth. Right? It's actually not to come to truth. It's to gain whatever it is you want. And so James, I think this is really apt as far as what could be going on. James says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Isn't it your passions within you? You murder because you do not have. You covet and cannot obtain. You fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. And you ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your own passions. And that's really the danger of like this tribalistic zero-sum game. Maybe that's not what's happening, but just looking at the evidence, it's really hard to come up with other motivations.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think also one of the questions that would arise, the document, the timeline, and sort of the players involved, you mentioned the churchmen. One of the things that could be a real problem here is it seems like the distrust among pastors and their people could actually go up. I was in an exchange, which Doug screenshotted and put in a Mablog, but I think he's from Canada. A young guy was, arguing with me repeatedly on multiple posts. Anons need to, in their handle, they need to have their pastor's contact information, and they need to submit, basically he needs to have complete oversight over his,
even like access to the account with the password so that he can edit any tweets he doesn't like.
Yeah, I mean, it's just gotten to this level, and I called it like the last thing pastors need to be is social media hall monitors. Like, we're busy. We have a lot of real issues to care for. And if a guy wants to go on X and talk about like flat earth or whatever it is, I'm like, I don't have really time to actually monitor all of that. So it seemed like kind of a ridiculous play, but I'm just curious if you see the potential that this erodes trust even further between pastors and their people.
Yeah, you have real problems where, like, again, the caricature is that, well, then people are just allowed to sin and you don't care about it in your flock. It's like, well, obviously not. You really do have guys who are sinning in their speech. We'll give an account for every careless word we speak, and that includes what we write online, of course. And so when it, if we had an issue with a church member and they were sinful in their speech in whatever direction, we would address it with them in a appropriate way, pastorally and that sort of thing. The hidden play though in the whole thing is like, therefore, if anons seem to be on your team and they're sinning, then their position becomes a part of your position,
and you're responsible.
That's the play that we need to reject out of hand and say, no, we've already talked about that. But I'm against people sinning. I know this is going to be really strong. I'm against people sinning. And so I would of course want to address sin wherever it lies. But the thing is, there's nothing special necessarily about social media that wouldn't apply to why wouldn't I as a pastor want to monitor all of their conversations at work or in private or with their friends.
Because at that point, I mean, we're social media, is included, but it's like, do I need to go through every bank statement from all of our people?
No, and we talk to our people, again, like about all of these issues, even just narrow it down to all these issues. We talk to our guys all the time about this stuff. I know where they all stand because shepherds ought to know the state of their flock and know their souls, keep a watch over them. Hebrews 13, 7 and 17. Just go see those passages. So we're doing that. We're shepherding our people. We're trying to, like, people can hide stuff, whatever. But we're doing that, and we're not doing it under a cloud of ignorance where we're just, well, if I ask them about their views on this stuff, then I'll have to find out what it is and maybe correct them. It's more that we're already having all these conversations with these folks. And the second thing is, I do want to be careful about the scope of pastoral authority and say that it's to the flat earth thing. It is not within the realm of my pastoral authority to discipline someone for holding a wrong view about the shape of the earth. Now, if they were doing certain things like saying, the Bible, flat earthers do this, the Bible demands that you be a flat earther, and if you're not, you're a heretic. And they were starting to be schismatic in the church, we would address that.
Right.
If somebody was saying...
So you're saying if they laugh at the wrong meme, like a flat earth meme, then they're not even a Christian, that sort of thing?
Yeah, we don't have authority to say that. If someone said all of a sudden they were spouting stuff about like, I want to genocide Jews or whatever, then, it's just like there's a distinction that we need to make between people's views of lots of things and my pastoral authority.
Yeah, I think that also is a repeated theme with American Milk and Honey, is that Doug will refer to things like, this is the Christian position on your view of the Holocaust. Or going back to the Antioch Declaration, they said this isn't like a creedal document, like you can be a Christian and not believe these things. Maybe some of this is just being careful with speech, but later Toby had said, well, I mean, I look at the document, this is just boilerplate orthodoxy. And I'm like, whoa. Your view on Aristotle is a matter of orthodoxy. Well, I think that's actually missing the point on what this, to your point, the scope of pastoral authority.
And the problem is that your view on Aristotle, that's not the claim of the document. It's that if you think that you would be contrary to the document, if you thought that Aristotle was the the picture of the ideal man, not Jesus Christ. Now, of course, you'd be outside Christian orthodoxy if you thought that. But the problem with that being included in a statement like this is, again, the implication is that there are people who are saying this, and they happen to be all our opponents on all this stuff. Right. It's a subtle implication.
Particularly Eric Kahn.
Well, yeah.
I mean, seriously, that's the implication.
A lot of these people. So the problem is that, okay, yeah, when you take things totally out of their context as absolute truth statements, yes, Aristotle is not surpassing the Lord Jesus Christ as the model of the ideal man. Of course.
But nobody said that.
But to say that in a statement implies that there's a widespread need to correct this erroneous view. And what it does is it just, in a very ham-fisted and rhetorically unsophisticated way, it associates people who are positive about Aristotle with that view that no one holds, which ironically would end up refuting NSA, since they've hosted talks about how to use Aristotle. And
it was actually funny because it was right afterwards, like Colin Redimer was at NSA talking about what Christians can glean from Aristotle.
So of course you could always retreat to I wasn't saying that you can't like Aristotle. Look, we like Aristotle. But the point is, if you include in your statement a refutation of a position nobody holds, you're actually doing something. Yeah. You're saying something in a plausibly deniable way that is, it's not helpful.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah, I think that's great. One of the other questions we wanted to answer is what kind of Christian nationalism, what brand of Christian nationalism are we promoting? And I guess just to kick us off, it would be the Canon Press published Stephen Wolfian kind of classical two kingdoms, reformed Christian nationalism. So Brian, I guess if you want to expand on that, first of all, do you agree with that?
Yeah. So this is one of the questions that, in terms of okay, positively though, Ogden guys, what are you actually promoting? Are you with all of the worst? Do you agree with the 10 worst things I could find Anon said on Twitter? We're no, let's just say positively, here's what we would defend and the ideas that we're kicking around and thinking through and in debating and all this is generally, what Dr. Wolf wrote in The Case for Classical Christian Nationalism, published by Canon Press. That's a pretty good summation of the kind of Christian nationalism that we are interested in promoting and discussing and even expanding, which is why we invited Stephen to come out to our conference last June. And we were very careful about asking him, we would like you to give this talk addressing this question, the failure and danger of multicultural pluralism, this kind of thing, and what we should build instead, because we were interested in his ideas and we wanted him to expand them into another question, not just rehash the book, but give us, and he took an extraordinary amount of time and put together a very helpful lecture, over an hour of well-reasoned discussion on this question. So what kind of Christian nationalism are we promoting? Well, one reason you shouldn't try to nuke Ogden is if you're Moscow is because it's the thing you published. That's the thing that we're promoting. So maybe there are other wings of Christian nationalism that have other views and maybe they find some of those problematic or something. But it really does come back to if you end up denouncing us, what you're denouncing is Dr. Wolf.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And then also, I would say at the conference, what was a great benefit, at least to me, it probably was to you guys as well, but having Stephen Wolf there and Dr. Rigney, being able to talk through some of these issues, White Boy Summer, we talked about everything. Yeah, and
Hitler, the Nazis, White Boy Summer.
I thought what was really helpful was when we were talking to Dr. Rigney, especially about this, he was like, oh, well, if that's what you believe, that's great.
That's cool. I'm cool with White Boy Summer, what you're saying. Yeah, we had probably hours of conversation with some combination of all those guys and all of them at different points, including Joel. And what was interesting is that as we discussed it, it was pretty much hey, what do you guys think about this? Is Hitler a Christian prince? No, okay, we don't think so either. What about, and we pretty much agreed on almost all of these. There's probably nuances and different or undeveloped thoughts that develop more later. But pretty much in those conversations, it was oh yeah, cool, same team. That's cool. I joked to those guys at one point, that you've run into the far wall of the right wing when you're denying the Holocaust happened, but you think it should have. like that's the level of it. But none of us have seriously ever promoted anything to that effect. Nobody there. So if anybody needed clarity, I don't think they really did. I think we've been pretty clear on all this stuff from the beginning. But it's it's kind of a letdown of an answer, because we're not like transgressive edgelords. At the end of the day, we're kind of like boring guys entering middle age who are interested in a lot of this stuff.
Right. Yeah, I think something from Christian nationalism that I think is helpful, Steve, it was controversial because of how we've all been hardwired theologically to think about the pastor's role. But one thing Stephen said was, I'm not an expert on all things theological, systematic theology. I'm doing a political work here. And I think there's actually something to be said where I could say the same thing. Like, I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a sociologist. I don't spend all my time thinking about how genetic traits transfer across, races, cultures, ethnicities, whatever. And so to be able to say, this is probably a great discussion. It's not the main focal point on a lot of these issues for ministers of the word. But I think because, Doug will write a book like American Milk and Honey, and it sort of gives the impression that pastors have to have an opinion on everything. So he's giving his take on the history of the nation of Israel and whether or not that's justified. And it's like, okay, that's fine if you're interested in that and you want to write something about that, but please don't present it as like the definitive Christian position.
Yeah, it's really the mixing of spheres of authority, right? Yeah, and that can be really unhelpful at times. When you make it a measure of Christian orthodoxy, you're saying that people that don't believe this are outside of orthodoxy. That's insane.
Right.
If you don't believe a certain historic narrative outside of the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ, outside of King David and the events that happened, surrounding King David, or if Samson existed, or, Adam and Eve, like those things that is orthodoxy. The formation of Israel, World War II, like those things are not in the realm of orthodoxy. I mean, you could have something that's just an absolute, complete lie there's evidence of, and you could be convinced, and somebody is believing a lie. That's a different thing than orthodoxy.
I think it would be similar to Haunted Cosmos, where you could say, okay, yeah, we have genuine hobbies. We're interested in these things. Some of them have, parallels with obviously, the Christian faith and theology and all that sort of thing. But if somebody comes to us and says, well, I don't believe in Bigfoot, we'd be like,
I don't care. I'm not like 100% believer in Bigfoot either.
Yeah, it's not orthodoxy.
An example would be, what if there's a lot of Christians in Palestine, Palestinian Christians. Imagine you were to make the position that no Palestinian Christians can be Christians, really, unless they agree with what Dennis Prager believes about the state of Israel. It would just be an a priori absurd position to take. And a lot of it, when it's stated very positively and very confidently, without people thinking through some of these issues like concretely, you can go, oh yeah, that's right. If you don't agree with that, basically you're not a Christian. But then when you start like, I don't think we're the guys who are known for being like, we need a ton of nuance all the time. But, let's actually have some nuance when we're talking about whether someone is inside or outside of the faith. I think that's a pretty important question.
Yeah, I think so. Final question that we'll address. What do we hope will be the result of an episode like this? Brian, you mentioned certain areas for repentance would be nice. I think for my money, just to start that off, I would say, okay, we've addressed Tobias on this privately, but it would be nice to have a retraction and repentance on calling us leaders of an anti-Semitic, racist movement in America. That would be nice.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I think for Doug and James in particular, we should not have pushed this public in the way that we did. Whatever our role was in it, this was a botch job, and maybe that's a good place to start.
And maybe even just saying, to clarify, people can disagree with my framing of anti-Semitism, how it's defined. There are other positions other than anti-Semite or agree with everything I say. Love that to be clarified. I would love to repent of anything that I've said that is sinful. If that is pointed out to me, I'd be delighted to do that. So it's not just, I want everybody else to repent and agree. Well, if there's anything that we've done or said that needs to be repented of, I'd love to repent of those things or have the opportunity to refute that they are sinful. So that's absolutely a big thing. The other thing that I would love is out of this to just be able, like, I think we're trying to lead the charge a little bit in this episode with just doing this. Let's bring all the stuff into the light. Let's talk about it directly so that everybody can stop sort of proxy warring and shadow boxing. We're just going to say all the stuff we've been thinking and talking about and have it open to correction or debate. I would love to see these kinds of debates continue in that spirit with a more surgical approach to who I am anathematizing on one edge to just disagreeing with on another, like that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think making careful distinction. I think also, and we would love to be a part of this, but getting some of these guys together to debate positions rather than kind of the rhetoric, I think, that's lobbed from afar, the mischaracterization of positions. So, for example, I would love to see Dr. Boot and Stephen Wolfe talk about theonomy versus a classical two kingdoms. Let's have a long form thing where we actually go through the positions, relying less, I think, on instantaneous rhetorical devices on Twitter. And because these are actually important discussions.
Yeah, totally.
As I said at the conference, I think actually the theonomists and the classical two kingdoms guys can get along and work together. I think
I've even seen it done.
I've seen it done. Yes, exactly. Dan, thoughts on that? Calls for repentance and or other things you'd like to see come from this episode?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, this rift has been formed, and there should be room, like you said, a precise discussion with charges, repentance, explanations, clarifying of issues and stances and beliefs and all of that, in order to come to unity. That'd be amazing, to actually be able to have those conversations. But quite honestly, first of all, who knows what God will do? Like, it's all in His hands. The Spirit will move and bring people to repentance.
We're doing what we can.
Convict people of their own sin, and helping them to repent, for us included, as well as all other parties. But quite honestly, let me give you my prediction as to what's going to happen. We're going to publish this episode, and it may get some attention, it may not. And I think there will be a lot of hand waving and dismissal. Just judging on the timeline and based on the facts, I think that is probably the most likely scenario. But I really, truly hope, for the sake of really God's people in the church, that that's not what happens. Because, Eric, you asked a question a little bit earlier, and we kind of missed a little bit of the answer for that. But through a lot of this, I think a lot of trust was lost in pastors, in the office of elder. I really do think that was one of the biggest hits, was that, okay, so first you have a church member that was caught in sin, whose sin was paraded before who knows how many thousands, tens of thousands, 100,000 people, I don't know, that his name is probably out there, right? I do think Tobias used his first name at least on a podcast. And so that really undermined a lot of trust. Like, it's one thing to have a pastor give an illustration from the pulpit using somebody in counseling, their sin as an example. That's like kind of immodest for a pastor to do that. But then to do that on a platform with as many eyes as could see, believer, unbeliever, just paraded out for all the world to see. I mean, that's on a whole nother level. And then just the infighting that has resulted from this, the contention, forcing people to actually take sides instead of just saying, Brian said this at the New Christendom press conference in his talk. We've said it elsewhere. It was really good, where he said, instead of saying, I appreciate Pastor so-and-so or this person, and I really respect their views. I disagree with them on these things, but I am for them and want them to succeed. Like, that would be great, but that didn't happen. Instead, it's been just an absolute all-out war of tarnishing reputations in this zero-sum game, to where it has undermined the trust of all parties involved. Because the thing with wrestling with pigs is that you get muddy, right? And that seems to be what has happened, is that all parties that have been involved, their reputations have actually been tarnished. And so it really has created a lack of trust amongst many Christians, or has actually firmed people into some small sin that they may have had in the recesses that they barely entertained and should have repented for. Not to say that they shouldn't, but has really inflamed that to the point where now there might actually be real malice and hatred and unrighteous anger towards men of God. And so that has been a real problem. And I would absolutely love to see resolution and repentance and for people to come together in this, to at least clear their names, to make this easier for the people that we've been charged by God to give an account of the state of their souls to God. Like that's what we've been charged to do, because we're not just media personalities or whatever. We're pastors first and foremost, and we have a task, a lofty task ahead of us to actually do that work. And so this has made it very challenging for a lot of the congregants, a lot of church members to actually trust pastors. And so at least for the sake of the people, like it would be wonderful if these men would repent and call us to repentance.
And I would love to be able to see, this is kind of maybe stated already, maybe unstated, I don't know, but I would love for people to be able to say, and all the parties to be able to say exactly that. I'm fine. I don't agree with so-and-so about this thing. Maybe I'm classical two kingdoms, not like a reconstructionist or theonomist, whatever. I think this about the question of Jewish influence in politics, Hollywood, whatever, and not this position. And I know they take a different position. That's great. They're still Christians. I think they're doing good work. May the Lord bless and keep them. One of the things we do on Sundays in our liturgy is to pray for a different church every Sunday. Their church, their officers by name, that sort of thing. And I can say every single one I remember praying for, because I usually do the pastoral prayer. Eric, you did one recently. Every single one of them, I could list manifold areas of theological, cultural disagreement about significant things even. And yet there's nothing inconsistent with holding those and saying, Lord, please bless this church in this other state, or please bless this church near us, that they would be strengthened in faith, that they would be refined by the Lord. Like we can do that. And I want even people who are interested and invested in some of these things to be able to do that, to have permission from us. Like you have my permission. You didn't need it, but you just know you have my permission to say, I like Joel Webbon. I like the King's Hall. I like Stories Are Soul Food. I like Cross Politic. I love these books from Doug. I like the Haunted Cosmos book available now at newchristendompress.com/cosmos. Just kidding. And I don't agree with everybody and everything, and that's cool. I want everybody to be able to do that.
You can even say, I don't like so-and-so, but I respect them, but I do disagree with them.
I disagree with them.
This is where I think actually so much of the infighting is happening because of the overlap of all these spheres. So like, I guarantee you there's a lot of King's Hall listeners at Apologia. I guarantee there's a lot in Moscow. And there's a lot of people here who are listening to their stuff. So
totally.
That's part of the reason for the contention. One other thing that I would throw out there, and we can all do a better job of this, but I think especially when you're disagreeing with a Christian brother for whom you share so much theologically in common, probably picking the most incendiary names to attach to people like Revoice for Nazis, because let's be real, everyone in our camp thought Revoice was a disgrace. It was terrible. It was awful. So it's kind of like if I was like, Moscow is kind of like BLM for Jews. If I was going to use that rhetoric, do you think it would broker peace? And I've asked a lot of the parties this, like, could we back down from some of the rhetoric? And I've equally called the young men, like, stop with all the like really disrespectful language and, just everything is about how fat somebody is. It's like, okay,
all right. I'll calm down.
There's a time
on the fat jokes, Eric. Jeez.
I know.
I'm sorry.
But I think just some of that too is like think about marriage counseling. Anytime we're counseling a couple and there's lots of conflict and strife, the first thing you want to do is like, can we stop catastrophizing? Can we stop using you always, you never?
Yeah.
You've got to be really careful in those situations if you want peace. And that's a big if. If you do want peace, deciding not to use the most inflammatory rhetoric possible will probably help your cause. Now, this is a big question that I've had in this situation. And I know a lot of people think that we're stupid and they're like, oh, you guys are being played or whatever. No, we're trying to pursue a Christian process for reconciliation, and we genuinely mean it. We want peace. And there are times and there are situations in life where you can want peace and not get it.
The week we're releasing this episode, we're meeting with various parties involved in this privately,
right?
And I'm sure we'll have wide-ranging discussions. And all of us hopefully will probably have things to take away. So just know, like we're not guys. We're not being played. We're not dumb. We have things we keep to. Well, sometimes we're dumb, but we have things we keep to ourselves. And a lot of it is like, for example, one of the reasons we haven't written like relentless numbers of blogs about the subject is because I actually consider some of the things we're trying to do positively, and that these other parties, a lot of them are also involved in, are about 100 times more important than this particular debate.
Yeah,
I think building Christian institutions, parallel economy, that building Christian churches with a spine, raising up men to leadership, fixing the Christian family. I think all of these things are of such high importance that we would be absolutely stupid to spend a significant amount of our time arguing about the finer points of World War II or the Nazis or something like that. That would be an all-time sidetrack, in my view.
Well, and ultimately, like even with the difference with James White on the Crusades, I think, okay, he has a different opinion. Keep ministering and keep doing the things that you're doing that are positive. We're going to keep doing the things that are positive on our end. Pray for you. God bless.
We're not going to start doing takedowns of dividing line episodes.
No,
I don't listen to it, but I mean, we're not going to start and then like comb through them and pull clips. And again, like I've told you guys this before, but my soul would die. I would quit the King's Hall if all of a sudden we had to either become a discernment ministry or stop. I would just stop, because I think that's
all it would take.
That's it. That's what would get me out.
Eric, I have an opportunity for you.
You receive.
I'm not getting in the middle of that.
I'm kidding.
You receive Brian leaves the King's Hall.
No, really good. Well, gentlemen, I think it's been a lengthy but a good and helpful, hopefully for our listeners, conversation. Brian, this time, if you would kind of close us down today.
Yeah. Like I just said, guys, I would say, especially for people who are listening to this show, some of you might hate our face, but a lot of you guys are probably like our guys. You appreciate the content we've made in the past. For whatever reason, you've connected with it. And I want to urge you to just remember that. I'm not saying that you're a sinner or an idolater if you're interested in these things or whatever. Nothing to do with that. But do make sure that you are in your soul before the Lord, loving your wife and your children well, serving your church well, being excellent in your vocation and whatever you do, and being careful in guarding your mouth, whether that's digital or out loud, from sinning. Like, we're all going to give an account for the words that we say. And that's a sobering thought for us. It should be a sobering thought for you. Make sure that one of the variables that you include in your calculation is Christian unity across disputes like this, because this isn't the first one. It's certainly not going to be the last one, that all of us occasionally have to pull the sword from our scabbard and do some jousting, even with brothers and friends. So you don't joust with a sword, but you know what I'm talking about. So I'd encourage you guys, whatever you do, do it with all of your might for the glory of the Lord, for the sake of his people. Give your life for your brothers and for the Lord, and you won't go astray. So Lord bless you guys. Keep pressing on. We see the work you guys are doing, and we pray that the Lord would bless you richly in it. We'll catch you next time on the King's Hall.